Before we begin, a massive thank you to Chris 8301 and so many others who suggested this story idea. Your enthusiasm for uncovering hidden truths inspires everything we do here. If you have ideas for future videos, drop them in the comments below. We read every single one. The photograph shouldn't exist. Elena Markovich stared at the image on her computer screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard in her dimly lit cubicle. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday in March, and she was alone on the third floor of the National Archives building in College Park, Maryland. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across rows of filing cabinets that held the secrets of a nation. The photo showed 5 men in dark suits standing in what appeared to be a Pentagon hallway. 4 of them she recognised from her years cataloguing Cold War documents. Secretary of Defense Neil McElroy, Vice President Richard Nixon, Admiral Arthur Radford, and a younger man she believed was one of Eisenhower's science advisors. But it was the 5th man who made her breath catch. He was tall, perhaps 6'3" or more, with sandy hair swept back in a style common to the late 1950s. His suit was impeccable, perfectly tailored, but there was something about his posture, the way he held himself, that seemed subtly wrong. Too straight, too still, like a statue pretending to be human. The file stamped across the bottom of the photograph read, Project Victor 1, do not release, eyes only. Eleanor had stumbled upon it by accident 3 hours earlier while processing box 4782 from the newly declassified records of the Office of Defence Mobilisation. Most of the box contained mundane correspondence about civil defence procedures and fallout shelter construction. But wedged between 2 reports on industrial production capacity was a manila folder with no proper classification markings, just a handwritten label that said VT Pentagon Residence 1957 to 1960. Inside were 12 documents, most of them heavily redacted, but what remained was enough to keep her rooted to her chair as the cleaning crew came and went, as her colleagues packed up and headed home to their families, as the building settled into its nighttime silence. A memo dated March 16, 1957, from the Office of the Secretary of Defence. Subject accommodation request, dignitary v. Thor. Reference is made to verbal authorization from highest authority regarding extended residence privileges for foreign dignitary Valiant Thor. Subject will require quarters within Pentagon Secure Zone, Level B2, for estimated duration 36 months. Security detail unnecessary per subject's explicit request. All inquiries regarding subject's nation of origin are to be redirected to this office, no exceptions. Foreign dignitary. But which nation? The memo gave no indication. Another document, this one from the Department of State dated June 3, 1957. Renuclear Disarmament Proposal Thor Initiative. This office has reviewed the technical specifications submitted by V. Thor regarding proposed energy alternatives to current nuclear weapons programs. While scientifically intriguing, the source of this intelligence remains unverified. Furthermore, implementation would require complete restructuring of strategic deterrence policy. Recommend classification Cosmic Top Secret and indefinite postponement of further consideration. Operation Refusal remains in effect. No external treaties or agreements without full Joint Chiefs consensus. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, rubbing her tired eyes. Operation Refusal. She'd never heard of it, and she'd catalogued thousands of Cold War documents. She opened a new search window and cross-referenced the term against everything in the archive's database. Nothing. She tried Valiant Thor next. The only results were from UFO conspiracy websites, breathless accounts of an alien ambassador who supposedly lived at the Pentagon during the Eisenhower administration, offering advanced technology and warnings about nuclear war. The stories were always the same. Thor was from Venus, he had a crew of fellow Venusians, he met with the president, and the government rejected his help because accepting it would mean admitting they weren't in control. Ridiculous. Venus was a hellscape of sulfuric acid clouds and surface temperatures hot enough to melt lead. No one lived there. But then why were these documents here? Why were they classified at all? Eleanor pulled up the photo again, zooming in on the tall man's face. His expression was pleasant but distant, like someone posing for a portrait they knew would never be displayed. she noticed something else. While the other 4 men cast clear shadows on the polished Pentagon floor, his shadow was fainter, less defined. Probably just the camera angle. Old film could be temperamental. She checked the metadata. The photo had been taken on September 14th, 1958, at 2:17 p.m. by a military photographer named Thomas Becker. Eleanor made a note to search for Becker's other work. Maybe there were more images in his collection. A sound echoed from the hallway outside her cubicle. Footsteps. Eleanor glanced at the clock. 11:53 p.m. The building should be empty except for security, and they typically stayed on the ground floor unless making rounds. The footsteps stopped outside her door. She minimised the photo and pulled up a random spreadsheet, trying to look busy with mundane work. The door didn't open. After 30 seconds of silence, she heard the footsteps retreat down the hallway. Probably just security doing their rounds, after all. She waited another minute before maximising the photo again. This time she noticed something she'd missed before. A handwritten notation in the margin, barely visible. She enhanced the contrast. Subject departed Pentagon residence March 16th, 1960. No forwarding address. No exit logged. All electronic security systems operational. No breaches detected. Room found empty during routine inspection. Someone had added below it, in different handwriting, impossible. Recommend investigation. And below that, in a third hand, investigation closed per OSD directive. File and seal. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the building's aggressive air conditioning. A man lived in the Pentagon for 3 years, then vanished without using any of the exits, and instead of launching a major security probe, they just closed the file. She needed to know more about Thomas Becker, the photographer. She needed to find out if any of the officials in the photo had written about this in their memoirs or personal papers. She needed to understand what Operation Refusal really was. But it was almost midnight, and she had work in the morning. Real work. The kind that came with deadlines and performance reviews. This was supposed to be a simple cataloguing job. Process the declassified documents, create proper finding aids, move on to the next box. Eleanor stared at the photograph for a long moment, then did something she'd never done in 7 years at the archives. She pulled out her phone and took a picture of her computer screen. Then she took photos of each document in the folder, being careful to capture every detail, every notation, every mysterious redaction. She would figure this out. Even if it was just a bizarre Cold War prank or some kind of psychological operation, the historian in her needed to understand the full story. What Elena couldn't know, was that taking those photographs had just made her visible to people who'd spent 68 years keeping valiant Thor's visit buried under layers of bureaucracy, misdirection, and strategic ridicule. In a windowless office 7 miles away, a computer algorithm flagged her employee ID number. The system noted the unusual late-night access, the search term she'd entered, the amount of time she'd spent on files that were supposed to have been fully reviewed and cleared years ago. A report generated automatically. Within minutes, it appeared on the secure terminal of a man who hadn't thought about Project Victor 1 in almost a decade. He read the report twice, then picked up a phone that didn't go through the regular network. "We have a problem," he said quietly. "Someone's found the Thor files." Eleanor woke to 17 missed calls. She'd silenced her phone before bed, exhausted from her late night at the archives. Now, at 6:47 a.m, she stared blearily at the screen as she sat up in bed. 4 calls from her supervisor, Margaret Chen. 3 from the archive's security office, 10 from a number she didn't recognise. Before she could decide which to return first, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. Margaret. "Eleanor, thank God. Where are you?" "At home. I was about to get ready for work. What's wrong?" "Don't come in." Margaret's voice was tight, stressed. "Your access badge has been suspended pending a security review." Elena's stomach dropped. "What? Why?" "I don't know the details." "I got a call from HR at 6:15 this morning. They said it's routine, probably just updating background checks, but they need you to stay home until it's resolved." "Margaret, I've worked here for 7 years. I have a top-secret clearance. What could possibly—" I know. I'm sure it's nothing. But protocol is protocol. I'll call you as soon as I know more." The line went dead. Eleanor sat frozen, her mind racing. This wasn't routine. Routine security reviews were scheduled weeks in advance with plenty of notice. They didn't happen overnight. They didn't result in immediate suspension. This was about the Thor files. It had to be. She pulled up the photos she'd taken last night, making sure they were backed up to her cloud storage. Then she created a second backup on a thumb drive she kept in her nightstand. If someone was going to make those documents disappear, at least she'd have proof they existed. Her phone buzzed again. The unknown number. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Miss Markovich?" A man's voice, smooth and professional. "My name is Robert Garrison. I'm with the Office of Personnel Management. I apologise for the early call, but we need to schedule a time for you to come in and complete some paperwork regarding your security clearance update. I was told to stay home today. Yes, just a precaution while we process the renewal. Nothing to worry about. We've been doing this with all employees who have access to recently declassified materials. You understand? We need to make sure everyone's properly vetted for the new protocols." The explanation was smooth, almost too smooth, but something about it rang false. The Office of Personnel Management handled federal employee records, but Archive's security clearances went through a completely different channel. "When do you need me to come in?" Elena asked, keeping her voice neutral. "Would today work?" "Say 10 o'clock. We have an office in Bethesda." "Can I come to the main OPM building instead? I'd prefer to handle this at the official location." Brief pause. "The Bethesda office is where we process these particular renewals. It would really be best if—" "I'll need to check my schedule and call you back," Elena interrupted. "What was your employee number?" Another pause, longer this time. "I'll have my assistant send you an email with all the details. We'll be in touch, Miss Markovich." He hung up before she could respond. Elena's hands were shaking now. That wasn't a government official. Government officials didn't give up that easily when you questioned them. They pulled rank. They cited regulations. They transferred you to supervisors. They didn't just politely hang up. Someone was trying to get her into an unofficial office to... What? Question her? Intimidate her? Make her forget what she'd found? She needed help. Someone who understood how these systems worked, who could tell her if she was being paranoid or if this was really as wrong as it felt. Eleanor opened her laptop and pulled up the employee directory for the archives. She scrolled through names until she found the person she wanted. Marcus Webb, Senior Archivist in the Modern Military Records Division. Marcus had been at the archives for 23 years. He'd worked on some of the most sensitive declassification projects in the institution's history. If anyone would know what to do, it would be him. She called his desk phone. No answer. She tried his cell. Marcus Webb. "Marcus, it's Elena Markovich from Cataloguing. Do you have a minute?" "Eleanor? Hey. Sure. What's up?" "I need to talk to you about something I found yesterday. Something weird, but not over the phone. Can we meet somewhere? Coffee?" Silence on the other end. When Marcus spoke again, his voice had changed. Quieter, more guarded. "What kind of something?" "Pentagon files from the late 50s. A visitor who doesn't appear in any official records. Papers that shouldn't be declassified if they're real, and shouldn't exist if they're fake." "Jesus, Elena," Marcus exhaled slowly. "Where are you right now?" "Home. My badge access was suspended this morning." Okay. Don't go anywhere until I call you back. 20 minutes. And Eleanor, don't talk to anyone else about this. Don't send any emails. Don't post anything online. Just wait for my call." He hung up. Eleanor set the phone down and wrapped her arms around herself. The apartment suddenly felt too quiet, too exposed. She went to her living room window and looked down at the street 3 stories below. A black sedan was parked across the street, its engine running. She could see the silhouette of someone in the driver's seat. How long had that car been there? She backed away from the window, her heart pounding. Maybe she was being paranoid. Maybe it was just someone waiting for a friend. But after the fake OPM call and the sudden badge suspension, paranoia felt like common sense. Her phone rang. Marcus. "Coffee shop on Wilson Boulevard, the one near the post office. 30 minutes. Come alone, make sure no one follows you." "Marcus, what's going on?" 30 minutes, Eleanor. We'll talk then." She grabbed her keys and the thumb drive, shoved them in her jacket pocket and headed for the door. In the hallway, she paused. If someone was watching the front entrance, they'd see her leave. But her building had a back exit through the parking garage. Eleanor took the elevator to the basement level and walked quickly through the dim garage to the rear stairwell. It opened onto an alley that connected to the next street over. She emerged into pale morning sunlight and started walking, resisting the urge to look over her shoulder. The coffee shop was a 20-minute walk, but she took a deliberately complicated route, doubling back twice and cutting through a grocery store to make sure she wasn't being followed. By the time she arrived, Marcus was already there, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee. He looked older than she remembered, grey at the temples, deep lines around his eyes. He gestured for her to sit. "Tell me everything," he said quietly. "Start from the beginning." Eleanor told him about box 4782, the Thor files, the photograph, the strange documents. She pulled out her phone and showed him the pictures she'd taken. Marcus studied them in silence, his expression growing darker with each image. When he finished, he looked up at her with something that might have been pity. "You need to forget about this," he said. "What? Delete these photos? Destroy any copies? Go back to work when they reinstate your access? Process your boxes and never mention Valiant Thor again?" "Marcus, these are legitimate historical documents. If they're real, they're real." His voice was flat. "And that's exactly why you need to walk away." Elena stared at him. "You've seen this before." "Not this specifically, but I've been doing this job long enough to recognize certain patterns. Every few years, someone stumbles across something they shouldn't. Usually it's about UFOs, sometimes it's about weapons programs or intelligence operations. The common thread is that the documents are always genuine, always declassified through proper channels, and always impossible to verify through any official source. That doesn't make sense. If they're declassified because someone wanted them declassified. Not for transparency, but as insurance. If the information ever becomes a problem, they can point to the fact that it's been publicly available for years and no one took it seriously. It's hiding in plain sight. So you're saying Valiant Thor was real? An actual alien living in the Pentagon? Marcus shrugged. "I'm saying the documents are real. What they describe, that's above my pay grade. What I know is that people who dig too deep into this stuff tend to have sudden career problems. Audits, security violations, transfers to dead-end positions. I've seen it happen. So we just let it go? Pretend we never saw evidence of the most important event in human history? You're assuming disclosure would be a good thing." Marcus leaned forward. "Think about it. If the government admitted tomorrow that an alien visitor spent 3 years at the Pentagon in the 1950s, what happens? Mass panic? Economic collapse? The complete erosion of institutional trust? Maybe the people who buried this did it for good reasons. Or maybe they did it because admitting we're not alone would mean admitting they're not in control." Marcus smiled grimly. "Probably a bit of both. Either way, it's not our call to make. We're archivists, Elena. We preserve records. We don't decide which truths the public can handle." "That's exactly what we do," Elena shot back. "Every time we decide which documents to highlight in an exhibition, which finding aids to prioritize, which stories to tell, we're making those decisions. We shape what people know about their history. Then shape it carefully, because the people who want this story buried have resources we can't imagine." As if on cue, Eleanor's phone buzzed. An email from an address she didn't recognize. eleanor.markovich.personal@gmail.com. The subject line read, "Regarding your research interests." She opened it. "Miss Markovich, we appreciate your dedication to historical accuracy. However, the documents you accessed yesterday are part of an ongoing review process and should not have been available for general cataloguing. They have been removed from circulation pending final declassification decisions. Your security clearance suspension is purely routine and will be resolved within 48 hours. In the meantime, we strongly encourage you to focus on your assigned responsibilities and avoid pursuing inquiries into materials outside your current project scope. Thank you for your understanding and cooperation. Robert Garrison, Deputy Director, Information Security Oversight Office." Elena showed the email to Marcus. He grimaced. "See? They're being polite about it now. That's the first warning. If you keep digging, the next contact won't be so friendly. How do they get my personal email? They're the government. They have everything. Eleanor's mind was racing. The smart play was obvious. Delete the photos, forget she'd ever seen the Thor files, go back to her safe, boring job cataloguing civil defence records. She'd keep her clearance, her career, her peaceful life. But she couldn't stop thinking about that photograph. About valiant Thor standing with men who'd shaped the modern world, offering them something. Knowledge, technology, help, and being turned away because accepting it would mean admitting Earth wasn't the centre of the universe. If it was true, people deserved to know. I need to find Thomas Becker, she said. Who? The photographer who took that picture. Military photographer, Pentagon assignment in the late 50s. If he's still alive, he might remember what he saw. Marcus closed his eyes. You're not going to let this go, are you? Would you? He was quiet for a long moment. When he opened his eyes, there was a mix of resignation and something else. Maybe respect, maybe concern. Thomas Becker died in 1991, Marcus said. But he had a daughter, Laura Becker Hammond. She lives in Alexandria. I helped her donate some of her father's papers to the archives about 5 years ago, mostly Vietnam-era photography work. But I remember she mentioned he'd kept a lot of his earlier stuff private, said it was too classified to share. Do you have her contact information? Eleanor, I really think... Please. Marcus sighed and pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts, then wrote a number on a napkin. This is her landline. But if you contact her, you didn't get this from me. And if anyone asks, we never had this conversation. Elena took the napkin. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You might end up wishing you'd listened when I told you to walk away. She left the coffee shop and walked 3 blocks before calling the number. It rang 4 times before a woman answered. Hammond residence. Hello? Is this Laura Hammond? Speaking. My name is Elena Markovich. I'm an archivist at the National Archives. I'm doing research on Pentagon photography during the Cold War, and I was hoping I could ask you a few questions about your father's work. Silence. Then, what specifically are you researching? Elena chose her words carefully. I found some images from 1957 through 1960. Pentagon interior shots, mostly official portraits and meetings. Your father's name was in the metadata. I wanted to understand more about the context of those photographs. More silence. Eleanor could hear breathing on the other end, could almost feel the woman deciding whether to hang up or continue the conversation. The archives already has my father's donated papers, Laura finally said. I know, but I got the impression from the collection notes that he kept some materials private. I'm particularly interested in anything from his assignment at the Pentagon during the late Eisenhower administration. Why? Because I think he photographed something important, something that was buried. The silence stretched so long that Elena thought the call had disconnected. Then, come to my house tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Don't bring anyone with you, and don't tell anyone where you're going. Laura gave her the address and hung up before Elena could respond. Elena stood on the sidewalk, her heart pounding. She was really doing this. She was investigating something that powerful people wanted to stay hidden, meeting with a stranger who clearly knew more than she was saying over the phone, and ignoring every professional instinct that told her to step back and protect her career. But she was also potentially on the edge of discovering proof of the most profound secret in human history. She walked back to her apartment, constantly checking over her shoulder. The black sedan was gone from its parking spot. That should have been reassuring, but somehow it made her more nervous. That night she barely slept. Every sound in the building made her jump. Footsteps in the hallway, the elevator chiming, the rumble of the HVAC system. She kept her laptop open, constantly refreshing her email and news feeds, half expecting some kind of digital attack or official notice that would make her investigation impossible. Nothing came. The silence was almost worse than a direct confrontation. At 8:30 the next morning, Elena called an Uber instead of driving her own car. Another precaution, probably unnecessary, but she was learning to trust her paranoia. The driver was a college student who spent the entire ride talking about his engineering classes and didn't seem to notice or care where they were going. Laura Hammond's house was a small brick colonial on a quiet street lined with oak trees. Elena paid the driver and walked up the front path. Before she could knock, the door opened. Laura was in her early 60s with short silver hair and sharp blue eyes that studied Elena with obvious suspicion. She wore jeans and a cardigan, sensible shoes, the uniform of someone who'd stopped caring what strangers thought about her appearance. "You came alone?" Laura asked. "Yes, phone off, please." Elena hesitated, then powered down her phone and showed Laura the blank screen. Laura nodded and stepped aside to let her enter. The house was neat, modestly furnished, filled with photographs, family shots, landscapes, a few that looked like professional military portraits. Laura led Elena to a small dining room, where a cardboard box sat on the table. "My father took over 40,000 photographs during his military career," Laura said, without preamble. "Most of them are in official archives, museums, or my donation to your institution. But there were some he would never let anyone see. He kept them in a safe deposit box and made me promise to never share them until certain people were dead." "What people?" "Richard Nixon died in 1994, Admiral Radford in 1973, Secretary McElroy in 1976. The last one on my father's list was James Killian, Eisenhower's science advisor. He died in 1988. After that, Dad said I could do whatever I wanted with the photos, but he recommended I burn them. But you didn't." "I was going to." "But then I started looking through them, and I realised they weren't just pictures. They were evidence. And even if no one would believe it, even if it sounds crazy, I think people deserve to know the truth." Laura opened the box and carefully removed a leather portfolio. Inside were dozens of black and white photographs, each preserved in archival plastic sleeves. The first photo showed the same scene Eleanor had found in the archives, the 5 men in the Pentagon hallway. But this print was uncropped, showing more of the corridor, more detail in their faces. Valiant Thor's expression was clearer here. He looked tired, sad even. The second photo showed Thor sitting in what appeared to be a Pentagon office, engaged in conversation with 3 men in military uniforms. A chalkboard behind him was covered in mathematical equations. The third showed him in what looked like a private apartment or quarters, probably the residence mentioned in the documents. He was reading a book. The camera had caught him unaware, and in that unguarded moment his face showed something Elena couldn't quite identify. Homesickness. Loneliness. There were more. Thor walking through Pentagon corridors. Thor in meetings. Thor standing outside the building, looking up at the sky with an expression of profound melancholy. And then the final photograph stopped Elena's breath. It showed Thor shaking hands with President Eisenhower in what appeared to be the Oval Office. The president looked grave. Thor looked resigned. Standing behind them was Vice President Nixon, his famous jowly face frozen in what might have been fear or awe. "My father was assigned to document a special foreign delegation," Laura said quietly. "That's what they told him. A representative from a nation that wanted to establish diplomatic relations but needed to keep the negotiations secret for security reasons. Dad was supposed to take official portraits, meeting photos, the kind of images they'd use for press releases once the relationship was made public. But it never was made public. No, because after 3 months my father started to realise this wasn't a normal diplomatic visit. The visitor never left the Pentagon. He had no security detail, no diplomatic staff, no official itinerary. And the people he met with, these were not the officials you'd assign to a routine trade negotiation. These were the people who controlled America's nuclear arsenal." Elena studied the Oval Office photograph. "Did your father ever say who Thor was?" "He said Thor told him he was from a place called the Solar Guard. Not a country. Not Venus, like the UFO stories claim." Dad laughed at that nonsense. "Thor said the Solar Guard was responsible for monitoring developing civilizations, and Earth had caught their attention when we started detonating nuclear weapons." "Monitoring from where?" Dad didn't know. He asked once, and Thor just smiled and said, "Closer than you think, but farther than you'd believe." Whatever that means. Laura pulled out one more item from the box, a small leather journal with worn edges. This was Dad's personal log from that assignment. He wrote down everything Thor told him during their conversations. The official photos were his job, but the journal was his insurance policy. He wanted a record in case anyone ever tried to make him forget or deny what he'd seen. She handed it to Eleanor. The journal was filled with precise military-style entries, dates, times, brief descriptions of photographs taken, but interspersed throughout were longer passages, conversations recorded in surprising detail. Elena read, March 23rd, 1957. VT asked me today why we photograph everything. I told him it's how we preserve history. He said his people don't need photographs because they don't forget. I asked if that was a blessing or a curse. He said both. We talked for nearly an hour about memory and loss. He told me his visit here would eventually be forgotten, or worse, turned into legend and mockery. He seemed sad about that, but not surprised. He said Earth isn't ready to join the wider community because we're still children fighting over toys. The toys just happen to be capable of destroying our entire world. Another entry from July 1958. Photographed VT in meeting with Joint Chiefs today. They wanted to know about defensive capabilities, what weapons his people possessed, whether they'd share military technology. VT told them they had no weapons because they had no enemies. The chiefs didn't believe him. General LeMay actually laughed and said, "Everyone has enemies." VT replied, "Only if you choose to make them." The meeting ended badly. I could see the frustration in VT's face afterward. He knows he's failing. And a final entry from March 1960. VT is leaving tomorrow. He told me his mission was unsuccessful. The leadership doesn't want what he's offering because accepting help would mean admitting we need it. Pride, he said. Earth's defining characteristic is pride. Before he left, he gave me a small device. It looked like a metallic sphere, perfectly smooth. He said if I ever wanted to remember what's truly important, I should hold it and think about humanity's future. Then he smiled and said I'd probably never use it because most people prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. I think he was right. I've kept the sphere in my desk drawer for 3 years and never once taken it out. Elena looked up at Laura. Where is it? The sphere? Laura reached into the box one more time and placed a small object on the table. It was roughly the size of a golf ball, made of some silvery metal that seemed to shift colour slightly in the light. Blue, then green, then back to silver. The surface was perfectly smooth, without any visible seams or markings. I've had it since Dad died, Laura said. I've held it a few times like he described. Nothing happens, it's just a metal ball. But it doesn't tarnish, doesn't scratch, doesn't respond to magnets. I took it to a metallurgist friend once, asked him what it was made of. He said the structure was wrong. The molecular arrangement didn't match anything in the periodic table. He thought I was pranking him with some kind of computer-generated hoax data. Elena reached out slowly and picked up the sphere. It was lighter than it should be and warm to the touch despite sitting in a cool room. As her fingers closed around it, she felt a strange sensation. Not quite vibration, but something similar. A subtle resonance. And then, for just a moment, she saw something. Not a vision exactly, but an impression. A feeling of vast distance and infinite patience. A sense of being watched over by something old and kind and impossibly far away. It passed in an instant, leaving her slightly dizzy. "What was that?" she whispered. "I don't know," Laura admitted. "I felt it too the first time I held it. Like someone was listening, waiting. I stopped picking it up after a while because it scared me." Eleanor set the sphere down carefully. "Why are you showing me all this? You could have destroyed it like your father suggested." "Because someone needs to know, and because something's happening again." "What do you mean?" Laura pulled out her laptop and opened a browser. She navigated to a government contracting database and searched for Aurora Consulting Group. Dozens of entries appeared. Contracts for advanced aerospace research, propulsion systems, energy technology. The company had been awarded over $2 billion in contracts over the past 10 years, almost all of them classified. "I started researching them 6 months ago," Laura said. "Aurora Consulting doesn't have a public website, no press releases, no corporate leadership listed anywhere. But if you dig through patent filings and university research partnerships, you find something interesting. She pulled up a patent document. The abstract described a field propulsion system utilising quantum vacuum fluctuations for thrust generation. The technical drawings looked like something from a science fiction movie. This patent was filed in 2019, Laura continued, but look at the date of the initial research proposal that led to it. She scrolled down. The proposal was dated 1959 from something called Project Refusal, Alternative Energy Research Initiative. Elena felt cold. Operation Refusal, that was in the Thor documents. Exactly. Someone took the technology Thor offered, classified it at the highest possible level, and has been slowly developing it in secret for over 60 years. Aurora Consulting is just the latest front company. Before that it was Hughes Aircraft. Before that it was Bell Labs. Before that a dozen other contractors. But the chain goes all the way back to 1960. Why keep it secret? If we have this technology, because releasing it would destabilise everything, energy companies, military hierarchies, global power structures, all of it based on scarcity and control, free energy, propulsion that doesn't need fuel, technology that makes borders meaningless. That's not just revolutionary, it's apocalyptic for anyone in power. Eleanor stared at the patent documents, her mind reeling. So we turned down the aliens' help, then spent 60 years trying to reverse engineer it anyway. Human pride and human ingenuity. We didn't want a gift, but we were perfectly happy to steal the idea and claim it as our own invention. Can I photograph all of this? The journal, the patents, the photos? Laura nodded. That's why I invited you here. But Elena, you need to understand what you're getting into. My father spent the last 30 years of his life looking over his shoulder. He was audited 9 times. His house was broken into twice. Nothing stolen, but files disturbed. He had a heart attack in 1991 at age 63, and I've never been convinced it was natural causes. You think they killed him? I think they made sure he stayed quiet, and if you make this public, they'll do the same to you. Eleanor thought about the suspended badge, the fake OPM call, the black sedan outside her apartment. They were already working on making her quiet. I have to try, she said. If this is real, if we've been lied to for 68 years about the most important moment in human history, people deserve to know. Even if they won't believe you? Especially then. Truth doesn't stop being true just because it's inconvenient. Laura smiled sadly. You sound like my father. He said the same thing right before he sealed all this away. Eleanor spent the next 2 hours photographing everything. The journal entries, the patents, every photo in the collection, the metallurgist's analysis of the sphere. Laura let her take the sphere itself, wrapped carefully in cloth. If things go bad, Laura said at the door, if they come after you too hard, just walk away. This truth has waited 68 years. It can wait longer. But Elena knew she couldn't walk away. Not now. She took another Uber home, the sphere heavy in her jacket pocket despite its impossible lightness. Back in her apartment, she uploaded everything to 3 separate cloud services under fake accounts, then encrypted copies on 2 more thumb drives. She mailed one drive to her sister in Portland with instructions to open it only if something happened to her. Then she did what any millennial archivist would do. She created an anonymous account on a document-sharing platform and uploaded everything. The response was immediate and predictable. Within hours, the photos were trending on conspiracy forums and fringe websites. Mainstream media ignored it completely. By the second day, professional debunkers had declared the photos obvious fakes, the journal a creative writing exercise, the patents misunderstood civilian technology. The story died within a week, buried under celebrity scandals and political controversies. Eleanor's badge access was restored with a terse email apologising for the administrative error. She returned to work to find box 4782 had been removed from her queue. Margaret wouldn't meet her eyes. Marcus stopped by her cubicle on her 3rd day back. You okay? He asked quietly. They won everything, Elena said. I gave the world proof and nobody cared. Maybe that was the point. Maybe they knew the best way to hide the truth wasn't to suppress it, but to let it get lost in the noise. drown it in so much information that it becomes invisible. So what was the point? Marcus smiled slightly. You know the truth. Laura knows. The people who read those documents know, even if they don't believe them. Truth is like a seed. Sometimes it takes a long time to grow. 3 months passed. Elena processed boxes, wrote finding aids, lived her quiet life. The sphere sat in her apartment, on a shelf between books, looking like an odd piece of abstract art. Then, on a Friday in June, her supervisor assigned her to a new project, cataloguing recently declassified State Department cables from the 1970s. In Box 47, between routine diplomatic correspondence, she found a memo dated July 12, 1977. Re-confirmation of secondary contact, Project Victor 2, subject matching physical description of V. Thor, see classified file 1957 to 1960, observed in meeting with Ambassador Young at UN headquarters. Subject identified himself as Valiant and requested private consultation regarding human rights initiatives. Security footage confirms subject entered building through main entrance but no exit recorded. Ambassador Young has been debriefed and instructed to classify encounter. Recommend continued monitoring. Pattern suggests periodic verification visits. Subject appears unchanged from previous documented encounters. Eleanor's hands trembled as she photographed the memo. She searched the rest of the box and found 2 more references, one from 1983, another from 1994. Each time, someone matching Thor's description appeared, had a brief conversation with a government official about pressing global issues, then vanished. He was still visiting, still trying, still hoping humanity would eventually listen. She looked up from her desk and saw Marcus watching her from across the room. He nodded slightly, understanding in his eyes. The truth was bigger than she'd imagined. This wasn't about one visit in 1957. It was about a commitment that spanned decades, maybe centuries. Someone out there cared enough about humanity to keep checking on us, keep offering help, keep waiting for us to be ready. That evening Elena rode the metro home during rush hour. The train was packed with exhausted commuters staring at phones, lost in their private worlds. She found a seat near the back and pulled out a book, trying to look unremarkable. At the Foggy Bottom station, a man boarded the crowded car. He was tall, wearing an unfashionable suit that looked like it belonged to a different era. Sandy hair, kind face, impossibly straight posture. Eleanor's breath caught. He moved through the car with practiced ease despite the crush of bodies and took a position near the door, holding the overhead rail with one hand while reading a folded newspaper with the other. Their eyes met for just a moment. His expression was gentle, knowing, sad. He smiled. The same sad smile from her father's photographs. The smile of someone who knew he was witnessing something important that no one else could see. Elena's hand moved to her jacket pocket, feeling the outline of the sphere she had started carrying everywhere. The train pulled into Roslyn. The doors opened. The tall man stepped onto the platform, then turned back to look at her one more time. He touched 2 fingers to his forehead in a small salute, then folded his newspaper and set it on an empty seat before the doors closed. Eleanor grabbed the paper as the train lurched forward. It was today's Washington Post, folded to the international news section. One article was circled in blue ink. UN Climate Summit reaches historic agreement. Nations pledge unprecedented cooperation on environmental crisis. Beneath it, in neat handwriting, small steps. Keep watching. Keep remembering. The choice is still yours. The newspaper trembled in Elena's hands. She looked up, pressing her face to the window as the train emerged from the tunnel into evening light. On the platform behind them, the tall man stood perfectly still, watching the train depart, a solitary figure growing smaller and smaller until he disappeared entirely. Eleanor pulled out her phone and started typing. Not an article, not a press release, but a simple email to Laura Hammond. He's still here, still trying. I saw him. The response came 3 minutes later. I know. Dad saw him too in 1989, 2 years before he died, at a bookstore in Georgetown, reading about the fall of the Berlin Wall. He said Thor looked pleased, like he'd been waiting for humanity to tear down a wall and we'd finally done it. Keep the sphere safe, keep your eyes open, keep believing that truth matters, even when no one's listening. Especially when no one's listening, that's when it matters most. Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the subtle warmth of the sphere in her pocket, the gentle pulse that might have been her imagination, or might have been something far stranger and more wonderful. Somewhere in the vastness of space, or perhaps somewhere much closer than anyone suspected, someone was watching over humanity with infinite patience, waiting for the day when we'd be ready to accept help without letting pride get in the way. That day hadn't come yet, but maybe, Elena thought, maybe people like her and Laura and Thomas Becker were the seeds Marcus talked about, small truths taking root in dark places, waiting for the right moment to grow. She opened her laptop when she got home and started writing, not for publication, not for proof, but for the record. A true account of what she'd found, what she'd learned, what she'd seen on the metro train. She would add it to the collection of evidence slowly gathering across decades, breadcrumbs left by archivists and photographers and ordinary people who'd glimpsed something extraordinary and refused to forget it. And someday, when humanity was finally ready, when enough seeds had taken root, maybe someone would piece it all together and understand. We were never alone. We were never abandoned. We were just a young species learning to grow up while patient guardians watched from the shadows. The truth was out there, hiding in plain sight, waiting in archived files and classified memos, and the memories of people brave enough to believe in uncomfortable truths. Eleanor saved her document, encrypted it, backed it up in 5 different locations. Then she picked up the sphere, held it in both hands, and thought about humanity's future. For just a moment, maybe imagination, maybe something more, she felt a response. Warmth, approval, hope. And somewhere far above, or perhaps very close by, valiant Thor smiled and continued his endless vigil, waiting for the day when Earth would finally be ready to join the wider universe as equals rather than children. That day would come, it had to. Truth always finds a way. What if everything you thought you knew about the pyramids was wrong? Imagine standing inside the Great Pyramid of Giza at midnight, alone, surrounded by 2.3 million stone blocks that have kept their secrets for over 4 millennia. The air is thick with mystery, and you can feel something humming beneath your feet. A vibration so subtle it might just be your imagination. Or might it be something far more extraordinary? Tonight joined Dr. Marcus Chen, a field researcher whose life's work straddles the boundary between archaeology and physics, as he uncovers evidence that will shake the very foundations of what we believe about ancient Egypt. This isn't just another story about pharaohs and burial chambers. This is about technology so advanced, so perfectly engineered, that modern science is only beginning to understand its true purpose. Are you ready to discover that the Great Pyramid wasn't built to house the dead, but to power the living? The desert wind carried more than sand that October evening. It carried the weight of 4,000 years of secrets, swirling around the massive limestone blocks that rose from the Giza Plateau like ancient guardians against the darkening sky. Dr. Marcus Chen pulled his field jacket tighter as he approached the entrance to the Great Pyramid, his archaeological permit clutched in one hand and a case of sensitive instruments in the other. For 15 years, Marcus had studied these monuments from afar, poring over blueprints in university libraries, analysing satellite imagery, and debating theories with colleagues over late-night coffee. He'd written papers on the pyramid's mathematical precision, its astronomical alignments, and its construction techniques. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this moment. The entrance shaft yawned before him like the mouth of some primordial beast. His Egyptian guide, Hassan, gestured him forward with a weathered hand that had led countless tourists through these passages. But tonight was different. Tonight Marcus had special permission to remain inside after closing, to conduct his research in the profound silence that only comes when the tourist crowds fade away. "Doctor?" "Chen," Hassan said, his English tinged with the accent of the Nile Delta. "You're sure you want to stay alone? The pyramid. She speaks differently at night." Marcus nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what Hassan meant. "I need to take measurements without interference. The electromagnetic readings are too important to risk contamination from cameras and cell phones." As they ducked through the entrance and began their descent into the ancient passageway, Marcus felt something he hadn't expected, a subtle vibration through the soles of his boots. It was barely perceptible, like standing near a power plant or a subway station, but unmistakably present. The limestone blocks seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, as if the entire structure were somehow alive. "Hassan," he said, pausing to place his palm against the cool stone wall, "do you feel that?" The guide's eyes met his in the dim LED lighting they'd strung along the passage. "You feel it too?" Most visitors, they notice nothing, but some, the ones who know how to listen, they feel the heart of the pyramid beating. Marcus's scientific mind immediately began cataloguing possible explanations: seismic activity from Cairo traffic, thermal expansion and contraction of the limestone, perhaps underground water movement. But as they climbed deeper into the structure, following the grand gallery toward the king's chamber, the sensation only grew stronger. The textbooks had described every measurement, every angle, every architectural feature, but they had failed to capture this, the sense that he was walking through the corridors of a machine rather than a tomb. The walls weren't just precisely cut, they were purposeful, functional, as if each block had been positioned not just to support weight, but to channel something else entirely. By the time Hassan left him alone in the king's chamber with his instruments and a promise to return at dawn, Marcus was beginning to suspect that everything he thought he knew about the Great Pyramid was about to change. The silence in the king's chamber was absolute. Not the gentle quiet of a library or the muffled stillness of a snow-covered landscape, but the profound absence of sound that only exists deep within solid rock far from the surface world. Marcus set his equipment case on the granite floor and began unpacking his instruments, but his eyes kept returning to the walls around him. For a structure supposedly built as the eternal resting place of Pharaoh Khufu, the king's chamber was remarkably empty. No hieroglyphs adorned the walls, no colourful depictions of the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife, no ornate decorations celebrating his divine status, just smooth, precisely fitted granite blocks that formed a perfect rectangular space. Marcus had visited dozens of legitimate Egyptian tombs, from the elaborate burial chambers in the Valley of the Kings to smaller mastabas scattered throughout the desert. Every single one had been filled with artwork, inscriptions and symbolic elements designed to guide and protect the deceased in the afterlife. The Egyptians were obsessive about decorating their tombs. It was perhaps their most distinctive cultural trait. So why was the most important tomb in Egypt completely bare? He pulled out his digital calipers and began measuring the chamber's dimensions, cross-referencing them with his notes. 10.47 metres long, 5.24 metres wide, 5.84 metres high. But as he worked, something else caught his attention: the acoustics. "Hello?" he called out softly, and the word came back to him transformed. Not a simple echo, but something more complex, a resonance that seemed to build upon itself, creating harmonics that his voice alone couldn't produce. He clapped his hands sharply and the sound reverberated through the chamber in waves, each echo slightly different from the last. Marcus had studied acoustical engineering as part of his physics background, and he knew what he was hearing. The chamber was tuned. The proportions, the materials, even the placement in the pyramid weren't arbitrary. They had been calculated to create specific resonant frequencies. He set up his sound meter and began a systematic test, clapping at different spots around the chamber and recording the acoustic response. The data was remarkable. The chamber was resonating at approximately 110 Hz, a frequency that research had shown could induce altered states of consciousness in humans. Ancient peoples around the world had built structures with similar acoustic properties. Newgrange in Ireland, the Hippogæum in Malta, certain chambers at Stonehenge. But there was something more. As Marcus moved his sound meter around the room, he noticed that the acoustic properties weren't uniform. The northeast corner produced different harmonics than the southwest. The centre of the chamber created the strongest resonance, while areas near the walls seemed to dampen certain frequencies while amplifying others. It was as if the entire chamber had been designed as a three-dimensional instrument, capable of producing complex acoustic patterns that modern sound engineers would struggle to replicate. This wasn't the work of ancient stonemasons building a burial vault. This was the product of sophisticated understanding of wave mechanics and acoustic engineering. Marcus sat cross-legged in the centre of the chamber and closed his eyes, letting the subtle vibrations he'd felt earlier wash over him. The sensation was stronger here, a low-frequency pulse that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. It reminded him of standing next to a massive pipe organ, feeling the bass notes resonating in his chest cavity. But there were no pipes here, no mechanical system that could produce such vibrations, unless... He opened his eyes and looked up at the ceiling, with its 9 massive granite beams supporting thousands of tons of limestone above. Each beam weighed between 25 and 80 tons, and had been quarried from Aswan 500 miles to the south. The precision with which they'd been placed was extraordinary. The gaps between them were uniform to within millimetres. What if those gaps weren't just structural? What if they were intentional spacing, designed to create specific resonant frequencies when subjected to external forces? The entire chamber could be functioning as a resonating cavity, with the granite beams acting as tuning elements. Marcus pulled out his electromagnetic field detector and switched it on. Immediately the device began registering low-level EM activity. Not strong, but definitely present and distinctly non-random. The readings were strongest near the walls and seemed to pulse in rhythm with the vibrations he could feel through the floor. No pharaoh had ever been found in this chamber. No evidence of burial had ever been discovered. No grave goods, no mummy. No indication that this space had ever served its supposed purpose as a tomb. But it was definitely serving some purpose. The question was, what? The next morning, Hassan returned to find Marcus still awake, surrounded by printouts from his instruments and covered in limestone dust. The researcher had spent the night exploring every accessible passage in the pyramid, and his findings were beginning to form a picture that contradicted everything in the archaeological textbooks. "Dr. Chen, you look like you have seen the jinn," Hassan said, offering him a thermos of strong coffee. "What did the pyramid tell you?" Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully and gestured toward his scattered notes. "Hassan, I need to see the subterranean chamber, the one most tourists never visit." Hassan's expression grew serious. "That chamber, she is dangerous. Very old, very deep. The air is not good there." "I have proper equipment," Marcus insisted, "and I think what's down there might be the key to understanding what this place really is." An hour later, they were descending through a narrow shaft that led to the lowest accessible level of the pyramid. The subterranean chamber lay more than 30 metres beneath the base of the structure, carved directly from the bedrock. As they went deeper, the temperature dropped and the air grew thick with moisture. The passage opened into a rough-hewn chamber unlike anything else in the pyramid. Where the king's chamber was precisely cut granite, this space looked unfinished, almost crude. But Marcus wasn't interested in the chamber itself, he was focused on the walls. "Hassan, bring the light closer." The LED beam revealed what Marcus had hoped to find: unmistakable signs of water erosion. The limestone walls bore the smooth, flowing patterns that only come from sustained contact with moving water. Not the random pitting of desert sandstorms or the crystalline deposits of occasional flooding, but the systematic erosion of deliberate water flow. Marcus ran his fingers along the channels carved into the rock. This wasn't occasional flooding. Water flowed through here regularly, probably for centuries. Hassan nodded. My grandfather, he told stories. Before the dam, before the modern irrigation, the Nile would flood every year. Sometimes the water would find ways underground, through cracks and caves. Maybe it came here. But Marcus was thinking about more than just flood patterns. He pulled out a geological map of the area and spread it on his portable table. The Giza Plateau sat on a limestone shelf that extended deep underground, honeycombed with natural caves and passages. The Nile, just a few kilometres away, had carved its path through this same limestone over millions of years. Hassan, what if the annual flooding wasn't accidental? What if this chamber was designed to flood? He pointed to the roughly carved passages that branched off from the main chamber, disappearing into darkness. These could be intake channels. When the Nile floods, water would flow through underground passages and fill this chamber, then rise up through the pyramid's internal structure. Marcus began sketching a diagram, his excitement growing. Look at this. Water enters here, rises through the Grand Gallery, which is angled like a spillway, and reaches the king's chamber. But that chamber isn't at the top of the pyramid. There are shafts leading up from it. Hassan studied the drawing. You think the pyramid was some kind of water machine? Not just water. Think about what happens when you force pressurized water through granite. Hassan looked puzzled, so Marcus elaborated. Granite contains quartz crystals. When you subject quartz to mechanical pressure, like water flowing under pressure, it generates electricity. It's called the piezoelectric effect. We use it in modern electronics. The implications were staggering. If Marcus was right, the Great Pyramid wasn't a tomb at all. It was a hydroelectric generator, using the annual Nile floods to create pressurized water flow through chambers lined with granite. The precise positioning of the granite blocks, the careful engineering of the internal passages, the acoustic tuning of the chambers, all of it could be explained as components of a massive power generation system. Marcus spent the next several hours taking measurements of the subterranean chamber, documenting the erosion patterns and mapping the passages. Every piece of evidence supported his growing hypothesis. The pyramid builders hadn't just been skilled stonemasons, they had been hydraulic engineers, working with an understanding of electricity that wouldn't be rediscovered until the 18th century. But that raised an even more disturbing question. If the ancient Egyptians possessed this level of technological sophistication, what else had they known that modern archaeology had missed? And why had this knowledge been lost? As they climbed back toward the surface, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking through the ruins of a civilization far more advanced than anyone had imagined. The desert wind that greeted them at the pyramid's entrance seemed to carry whispers of forgotten science, lost wisdom, and secrets that someone had gone to great lengths to hide. The next day found Marcus standing on the Giza Plateau at dawn, his GPS equipment spread out on a folding table, as the first rays of sunlight painted the ancient stones in shades of gold and amber. Hassan had brought along his cousin Karim, a modern engineer who worked for the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and had access to more sophisticated surveying equipment than Marcus could carry. "Dr. Chen, you said you wanted to verify the pyramid's alignment," Karim asked, adjusting the precision GPS receiver. "I must tell you, this has been measured many times. The accuracy is well documented." Marcus nodded, checking his own instruments. "I'm not questioning the accuracy. I'm trying to understand why that accuracy was necessary." The numbers were indeed remarkable. As the GPS data streamed in and the surveying laser painted its invisible lines across the desert, the measurements confirmed what archaeologists had known for decades. The Great Pyramid was aligned to true north, with an accuracy of just 3 arc minutes, less than 1/20th of a degree. In modern terms, that was more precise than the magnetic compasses available to 19th century explorers. But Marcus was looking at more than just cardinal directions. He had brought along a magnetometer, an instrument that could detect variations in the Earth's magnetic field. As he moved the device around the pyramid's base, the readings told a fascinating story. "Karim, look at this." Marcus showed him the magnetometer display. The pyramid isn't just aligned to true north, it's positioned at a point where the Earth's magnetic field shows unusual characteristics. The Giza Plateau sat at a convergence point of several magnetic anomalies. Underground iron ore deposits created localized field variations, while the limestone bedrock contained enough ferrous minerals to influence compass readings. But more significantly, the pyramid's position corresponded to a point where the Earth's natural electromagnetic currents were particularly strong. Marcus had studied similar phenomena at other ancient sites. Stonehenge sat on a complex intersection of underground streams and geological fault lines that created measurable electromagnetic effects. Newgrange in Ireland was positioned where two underground rivers converged, creating conditions that produced natural electrical fields. Machu Picchu was built on a granite peak that generated piezoelectric charges during seismic activity. The pattern was consistent. Ancient builders had chosen locations where the Earth's natural electromagnetic properties were enhanced. They hadn't just been looking for stable ground or religious significance, they had been searching for specific energetic conditions. Hassan, Marcus called to his guide, who was photographing the sunrise from the pyramid's eastern face, "Your grandfather's stories. Did any of them mention lights?" Hassan walked over, his expression thoughtful. "Lights? You mean like the tourist illumination?" "No, I mean lights that might have been seen historically, strange lights, unexplained phenomena." Hassan's eyes widened slightly. "Ah, yes. The old people, they would speak of the lights that danced around the pyramid during certain seasons, usually during the flood time, when the Nile was high. They called them the souls of the pharaohs, but my grandfather, he was educated man. He thought maybe they were something else." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. What kind of something else? He worked for British archaeologists in the 1920s. They had instruments, cameras. One night during flood season, they saw lights moving around the pyramid's apex. Blue-white lights, like electricity. The photographs they took showed, what do you call them? Discharge patterns. Electromagnetic discharge. Marcus had seen similar phenomena at other ancient sites during periods of high atmospheric electricity. If the pyramid was designed to interact with the Earth's electromagnetic field, then during certain conditions, perhaps when underground water levels were high and atmospheric electrical activity was increased, it might actually generate visible electrical discharges. Marcus spent the morning taking detailed measurements of the electromagnetic conditions around the pyramid. The data revealed a complex pattern of electrical activity that varied with the time of day, the season, and the underground water levels. The pyramid wasn't just passively sitting in an electromagnetically active location. It appeared to be designed to harness and focus that activity. The internal structure suddenly made more sense. The king's chamber, with its precise granite construction, would act as a focal point for electromagnetic energy generated by the pressure of water on quartz crystals. The shaft systems leading from the chamber would serve as waveguides, directing the electrical energy toward the pyramid's apex. The entire structure was essentially a massive electromagnetic antenna, designed to capture, generate and transmit electrical energy using natural forces. But transmit it where? And for what purpose? As Marcus packed his equipment, he realized he was no longer looking at an ancient tomb or even an advanced power plant. He was looking at a piece of technology so sophisticated that modern science was only beginning to understand its principles. The builders of the Great Pyramid hadn't just mastered hydraulic engineering and electromagnetic theory. They had created a machine that interfaced directly with the planet's own energy systems. The question that haunted him as they walked back to the nearby village was this: if such advanced technology had existed over 4,000 years ago, what had happened to the civilization that created it? Dr. Amara Soliman met Marcus at a coffee shop in central Cairo, away from the tourist crowds and government oversight that surrounded the Giza Plateau. As one of Egypt's leading thermal imaging specialists, she'd been involved in some of the most significant recent discoveries at the pyramids, including the 2015 detection of mysterious voids within the Great Pyramid structure. "Dr. Chen," she said, sliding a tablet across the small table between them, "what you're asking to see, these images are not for public distribution. The Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities has been very careful about how this information is released." Marcus studied the thermal imaging data on the screen. The pyramid appeared as a three-dimensional wireframe, with different colours indicating temperature variations within the stone. But there, clearly visible in the computer-enhanced images, were several dark voids, empty spaces within the solid limestone structure where no chambers were supposed to exist. "How many voids have you detected?" Marcus asked. "At least 4 significant ones," Dr. Soliman replied, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. 2 above the king's chamber, 1 behind the queen's chamber, and 1 near the base that appears to connect to the subterranean areas. But there's something else. She switched to a different set of images, these taken with ground-penetrating radar and electromagnetic sensors. These voids aren't natural. They show clear geometric patterns, right angles, precisely measured dimensions. Someone built these spaces intentionally, then sealed them so completely that they've remained hidden for over 4,000 years. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Have there been any attempts to access them? Dr. Solomon's expression grew troubled. That's where things become political. In 2017, an international team proposed using micro-robotics to explore one of the smaller voids. They had the technology, the funding and preliminary approval from the Archaeological Committee. Then suddenly the project was cancelled. No explanation, no appeal process, just stopped. She leaned closer, her voice barely audible above the coffee shop's ambient noise. Dr. Chen, I've worked on heritage preservation projects throughout Egypt for 15 years. I've seen government bureaucracy, funding problems, international disputes over archaeological sites. This was different. This was suppression. Marcus thought about his own experience getting research permission. The process had taken 8 months and required letters of recommendation from 3 different universities, a detailed research proposal, and a substantial fee. But even with all that paperwork, his access was limited to already known chambers during specific time windows. What do you think is in the sealed chambers? He asked. Dr. Solomon switched to another set of images, these showing electromagnetic anomalies within the hidden voids. These readings suggest metallic objects, not just small artifacts, large structures with geometric patterns. If I had to guess based on the electromagnetic signatures, I'd say we're looking at copper or bronze constructions, possibly in the form of coils or geometric frameworks. Marcus's mind raced. Copper coils would be consistent with his power plant hypothesis. They could serve as electromagnetic conductors or even primitive electrical components. Bronze geometric frameworks might function as focusing elements for electromagnetic energy. There's something else, Doctor, Solomon continued, bringing up a final image. This thermal scan was taken during different seasons over a 3-year period. Look at how the temperature signatures in the voids change. The hidden chambers appeared to respond to external conditions, cooling during dry seasons and warming during periods of high humidity. More intriguingly, the temperature variations showed patterns that corresponded to the Nile's traditional flood cycle, even though the river had been controlled by dams for decades. It's as if these chambers are still responding to environmental changes, Dr. Solomon said, as if whatever system they're part of is still partially functional. Marcus studied the data for several minutes, his theory crystallizing into something approaching certainty. The Great Pyramid wasn't just an ancient power plant, it was a machine with components that were still sealed inside, still responding to the same environmental triggers that had activated it thousands of years ago. Dr. Solomon, hypothetically, if someone wanted to access these chambers using modern technology, how would they do it? She looked around the coffee shop nervously. Hypothetically? Millimeter wave radar could map the internal structure precisely. Microbore drilling could create access holes small enough to insert fibre optic cameras. With the right equipment, you could explore these spaces without causing significant structural damage to the pyramid. Marcus nodded, already calculating what such an expedition would cost and how it might be organised. But Dr. Solomon wasn't finished. Dr. Chen, there's something you should know. I'm not the first person to detect these chambers, and I won't be the last. But every researcher who has tried to investigate them seriously has found their access restricted, their funding cut, or their careers redirected. The Egyptian government isn't trying to preserve the pyramid from damage. They're trying to preserve its secrets from discovery. As Marcus walked back through Cairo's bustling streets, he realised he was no longer conducting academic research. He was investigating a cover-up that had been maintained for decades, possibly longer. The question was no longer what the pyramid had been designed to do. It was why someone was so determined to prevent modern science from finding out. That night, Marcus returned to the pyramid alone. Hassan had arranged for him to have extended access, though the guide had seemed reluctant to leave him there as darkness settled over the Giza plateau. Doctor, Chen, the pyramid. She's different at night. You be careful, yes? Some knowledge, it comes with price. Now, sitting in absolute darkness in the king's chamber with his instruments powered down and his cell phone turned off, Marcus could feel what Hassan had meant. The vibrations he'd noticed on his first day weren't stronger at night. They were clearer, unmasked by the electromagnetic interference of modern technology and the subtle vibrations of daytime activity. The feeling was unmistakable now, a low-frequency pulse that seemed to emanate from the very stones around him. It reminded him of sitting in a car with a powerful subwoofer, feeling the bass notes resonating in his chest. Except this sensation seemed to penetrate deeper, affecting not just his body but his consciousness itself. Marcus had brought along a new piece of equipment, a sensitive electromagnetic field detector borrowed from Dr. Solomon's laboratory. In the complete darkness and electrical silence of the chamber, the device could register even the faintest electromagnetic activity. He switched it on and watched the display with growing amazement. The pyramid was generating electricity. Not much. The readings were measured in millivolts and microamps, but the output was consistent, rhythmic, and definitely real. The electromagnetic field strength varied in cycles that corresponded to the acoustic resonance he'd measured earlier. The entire structure was functioning as a low-level electrical generator, powered by forces he was only beginning to understand. Marcus activated his night vision camera and began recording, speaking in whispers to avoid disturbing whatever delicate processes he was observing. The electromagnetic readings are strongest near the northeast corner of the chamber, consistent with the acoustic anomalies I documented earlier. The field strength appears to correlate with lunar cycles. Tonight's readings are approximately 20% higher than last week's, coinciding with the new moon. He moved the detector around the chamber, mapping the electromagnetic field as he had mapped the acoustics. The patterns were complex but consistent, forming a three-dimensional matrix of electrical activity that encompassed the entire chamber. At the centre of the room, where the pharaoh's sarcophagus should have been, the electromagnetic field reached its peak intensity. But there was something else. As Marcus sat in the centre of the chamber, surrounded by the electrical field generated by 4,000 years of precisely engineered stone, he began to experience something unexpected, altered consciousness. It started as a subtle shift in perception, similar to the disorientation he'd felt at high altitude or during meditation. But as he remained motionless in the electromagnetic field, the sensation deepened. His thoughts became clearer, more focused, while his awareness of the chamber around him expanded. He could sense the massive weight of the pyramid above him, the underground chambers below, even the subtle movements of air through the shaft systems. Marcus realised that the 110 Hz acoustic resonance he'd measured wasn't accidental. It was the exact frequency that research had shown could induce theta brainwave states associated with deep meditation, enhanced creativity, and altered consciousness. Combined with the electromagnetic field, the king's chamber functioned as a consciousness-altering device. But why? What purpose would ancient builders have had for creating a machine that could systematically alter human consciousness? As Marcus sat in the pyramid's electromagnetic embrace, understanding dawned on him like sunrise over the desert. The pyramid wasn't just a power plant, it was a communication device. The electrical energy it generated wasn't meant to power lights or machinery. It was designed to amplify and transmit human consciousness itself. The ancient Egyptians had built the ultimate meditation chamber, a place where human awareness could be enhanced, expanded, and potentially transmitted across vast distances. The precision engineering, the electromagnetic properties, the acoustic tuning, all of it served to create conditions where consciousness could transcend the normal limitations of the human brain. Marcus thought about the ancient Egyptian concepts of Ka and Ba, aspects of the human soul that could travel beyond the physical body. What if these weren't just religious beliefs, but actual descriptions of consciousness, projection experiences facilitated by the pyramid's technology? The implications were staggering. If ancient Egyptians had mastered consciousness projection, They could have explored distant lands without physical travel, communicated across vast distances without messengers, and perhaps even preserved knowledge in ways that transcended physical destruction. The pyramid might have been their internet, their telecommunications network, their method of backing up human consciousness itself. Marcus's instruments continued recording as his awareness expanded further. He could sense other presences in the chamber, not supernatural entities, but echoes of the thousands of people who had experienced altered states in this space over the millennia. The pyramid had been accumulating consciousness, storing it in some form that science didn't yet understand. As the hours passed, Marcus began to comprehend the magnitude of what he'd discovered. The Great Pyramid wasn't just an ancient monument, it was a machine for expanding human potential, built by a civilization that understood the relationship between consciousness, electromagnetic energy, and the fundamental structure of reality itself. But why had this knowledge been lost, and why were modern authorities so determined to prevent its rediscovery? As dawn approached and the electromagnetic readings began to fluctuate with the rising sun, Marcus made a decision that would change the course of his research, and possibly his life. He wasn't going to publish his findings in academic journals where they could be dismissed or suppressed. He was going to find a way to demonstrate the pyramid's true capabilities to the world. The Age of Secrets was about to end. 3 weeks after his night in the King's Chamber, Marcus found himself in a secure conference room at Cairo University, surrounded by researchers who had responded to his carefully worded communications. Dr. Solomon sat across from him, along with Dr. James Morrison, a British archaeoacoustic specialist, Dr. Elena Kozlov, a Russian electromagnetic researcher, and surprisingly, Dr. Sarah Running Bear, a Lakota physicist who studied indigenous sacred sites in North America. "What you're suggesting, Doctor?" "Chen," Dr. Morrison said, reviewing Marcus's data on his tablet, "goes beyond revolutionary. You're proposing that ancient civilizations possess technology that we're only beginning to understand." Marcus nodded, pulling up a global map on the room's display screen. Red dots marked locations across every continent. It's not just a proposal anymore. Thanks to Dr. Running Bear's research, we've identified 47 sites worldwide that show identical electromagnetic signatures to the Great Pyramid. Dr. Running Bear leaned forward, her voice carrying the weight of generational knowledge. "My people have always known that certain places were different. We called them places where the earth speaks, the acoustic properties, the electromagnetic anomalies, the consciousness-altering effects. They're all documented in our oral traditions." She pointed to several dots in North America. Serpent Mound in Ohio, the Medicine Wheels of Wyoming, certain kivas in the southwest. They all show the same engineering principles, positioning at electromagnetic convergence points, internal geometries designed for acoustic resonance, materials chosen for their piezoelectric properties. Dr. Kozlov, who had been quietly analysing electromagnetic data, looked up with excitement. "I've been comparing the frequency patterns from these sites. They're not random, they form a harmonic sequence. Each site resonates at frequencies that complement the others, as if they were designed to work together as a single system." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. A single system spanning the entire globe. "More than that," Dr. Kozlov continued, pulling up a complex waveform analysis. "If all these sites were activated simultaneously, the combined electromagnetic output would create a standing wave pattern around the Earth. The planet itself would become a resonating chamber." The implications hung heavy in the room. Marcus thought back to his experience in the King's Chamber, the sense of connecting not just to the pyramid, but to something vast and worldwide. Had he been tapping into a dormant global network that once linked human consciousness across continents? Dr. Morrison cleared his throat. "There's something else we need to consider. I've been analysing historical records of these sites, looking for patterns of suppression. It's remarkable how consistently ancient knowledge about these places has been discouraged." He brought up a timeline on his laptop. The Library of Alexandria burned multiple times, always targeting texts about natural philosophy and sacred geometry. The Spanish conquistadors systematically destroyed Mayan and Aztec codices that contained astronomical and architectural knowledge. The British Empire consistently relocated indigenous populations away from sites that showed electromagnetic anomalies. Dr. Running Bear's expression darkened. My ancestors were forced from sacred sites across North America. The official reason was always agricultural development or mineral rights, but they consistently targeted places where consciousness-altering experiences were known to occur. Marcus felt a chill of recognition. The same pattern of suppression he'd encountered with the pyramid's hidden chambers was part of a much larger historical trend. Someone, or some group, had been systematically working for centuries to prevent humanity from rediscovering its technological and spiritual heritage. The question is, Dr. Solomon said quietly, what would happen if we reactivated this network? Dr. Solomon's question haunted Marcus for days. The theoretical implications of reactivating an ancient global consciousness network were staggering, but the practical challenges seemed insurmountable. Most of the sites were under government control, protected by restricted access, or surrounded by modern development that would interfere with their electromagnetic properties. But Marcus couldn't let go of what he'd experienced in the King's Chamber. The sense of expanded awareness, of connection to something vast and ancient, had fundamentally changed his understanding of human potential. If that experience could be replicated and shared, it might represent the next stage of human evolution. The answer came from an unexpected source. Hassan appeared at Marcus's hotel room door early one morning, carrying a worn leather satchel and wearing an expression of nervous determination. Doctor, Chen, my family, we have been guardians longer than we have been guides. My great-grandfather, before the British came, before the tourists, he was keeper of the old knowledge. Hassan opened the satchel to reveal documents that made Marcus's breath catch. Hand-drawn maps showing underground passages throughout the Giza Plateau. Detailed diagrams of the pyramid's internal structure, including chambers that weren't on any official archaeological survey, and most remarkably technical drawings that showed how the pyramid's systems could be manually activated. The old knowledge, it was never lost completely, Hassan continued. Hidden, yes. Dangerous to speak of, yes. But preserved by families like mine, waiting for someone who could understand its importance. The drawings revealed that the pyramid's consciousness-amplifying effects weren't automatic. They required specific activation procedures. Water had to be introduced into the subterranean chambers at precise volumes and timing. Certain crystals needed to be placed in the sealed chambers to focus the electromagnetic fields. And most crucially, multiple people had to participate simultaneously, their consciousness working together to achieve resonance with the global network. Hassan, this is incredible, but how could we possibly implement it? We'd need access to the sealed chambers, permission for extended stays in the pyramid, and coordination with researchers at sites around the world. Hassan smiled, the expression of a man who had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Dr. Chen, who do you think has been maintaining the pyramid systems all these years? The tourist guides, the security staff, the maintenance workers. Many of us are descendants of the original guardians. We have been waiting for someone like you, someone who could understand what we have been protecting. Over the next few hours, Hassan revealed the existence of a network of guardians at ancient sites worldwide. Families who had maintained the old knowledge for generations, keeping the sites minimally functional while waiting for the time when they could be fully reactivated. The suppression Marcus had encountered wasn't just from modern governments. It was part of an ancient conflict between those who sought to preserve transformative knowledge and those who feared its implications for existing power structures. But now, Hassan said, his eyes bright with possibility, the time of hiding is ending. The world is ready for the old wisdom to return. Marcus spent the next week in secret meetings with Hassan's network. They showed him hidden passages that connected the pyramids at Giza to underground chambers extending for kilometers beneath the desert. They revealed caches of ancient crystals and metallic components that could be used to restore the pyramid's full functionality. Most remarkably, they demonstrated that they had been maintaining contact with Guardian networks at other sites around the world, using methods that seemed to blend ancient wisdom with modern technology. The plan they developed was audacious beyond anything Marcus had imagined. On the night of the next new moon, when electromagnetic conditions would be optimal, Guardian networks at 12 major sites would simultaneously activate their monuments' consciousness-amplifying systems. The Great Pyramid would serve as the primary node, with Marcus and the research team providing scientific documentation of the process. If successful, the experiment would create the first coordinated activation of the global consciousness network in over 3,000 years. The effects, according to the Guardian's preserved knowledge, would be felt worldwide. A sudden expansion of human awareness that could fundamentally alter the course of civilization. But there were risks. The ancient texts spoke of individuals who had been unprepared for the experience, whose consciousness had been overwhelmed by the sudden expansion of awareness. There were warnings about the network attracting the attention of forces that had opposed its use in the past, and there was the very real possibility that modern governments would respond to the activation with force, viewing it as a threat to established order. As Marcus stood in the King's Chamber 1 week before the planned activation, surrounded by crystals and metallic components that Hassan's people had been safeguarding for millennia, he realized that he was about to participate in either the most important experiment in human history or the most dangerous. The pyramid hummed around him with renewed energy, its systems responding to the presence of the missing components. Through his consciousness, he could sense the other sites coming online around the world, their guardians preparing for an event that would either herald humanity's next evolutionary leap or mark the end of the Age of Secrets forever. The night of the new moon arrived with unprecedented atmospheric conditions. Aurora activity extended far beyond the polar regions, creating shimmering curtains of light visible even in Egypt's desert sky. Electromagnetic storms disrupted satellite communications worldwide, while seismic monitoring stations detected subtle but synchronized vibrations from ancient sites across the globe. Marcus stood in the King's Chamber surrounded by Hassan's Guardian network and the international research team. The chamber had been transformed. Crystalline structures now occupied the corners, their faceted surfaces catching and redirecting the subtle light from their instruments. Copper coils, fashioned according to ancient diagrams, had been positioned to enhance the room's natural electromagnetic properties. Most remarkably, water from the Nile's ancient flood channels had been carefully directed into the subterranean chambers, creating the hydraulic pressure needed to activate the pyramid's piezoelectric systems. Dr. Running Bear checked her communication device one final time. Serpent Mound is reporting full activation. The electromagnetic readings are unlike anything we've ever recorded. Dr. Morrison, monitoring from Newgrange and Ireland, transmitted similar reports. The acoustic resonance here is building beyond our measurement capabilities. The entire mound is vibrating in harmony with frequencies we didn't know existed. Around the world, Guardian networks at sites from Machu Picchu to Angkor Wat were reporting the same phenomenon. Ancient monuments that had been dormant for millennia were awakening, their consciousness-amplifying systems responding to coordinated activation for the first time in recorded history. In the King's Chamber, Marcus felt the familiar sensation of expanded awareness beginning to build. But this time, it was different, stronger, more focused, and connected to something vast beyond individual consciousness. Through the electromagnetic field generated by the activated pyramid, he could sense the presence of people at the other sites, their awareness merging into a collective experience that transcended physical distance. Dr. Kozlov, monitoring the electromagnetic readings, whispered in amazement, "The standing wave pattern is forming exactly as predicted. The Earth's electromagnetic field is reorganizing itself around these sites." But the experience went beyond scientific measurement. As the network reached full activation, Marcus found his consciousness expanding not just across space but across time. He could sense the pyramid builders themselves, not as historical figures but as present awareness, as if their consciousness had been preserved within the structure itself, waiting for this moment of reactivation. The ancient Egyptians hadn't just built a machine for amplifying consciousness, they had created a means of preserving it across millennia. The pyramid was a library of human awareness, containing the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that had achieved levels of understanding that modern science was only beginning to approach. Through the network, Marcus experienced visions of the ancient world as it had truly been. not the primitive civilization described in history textbooks, but a global culture connected by consciousness-amplifying technology, capable of feats that seemed magical only because the principles had been forgotten. He saw the construction of the monuments not as slave labour directed by megalomaniacal pharaohs, but as collaborative projects undertaken by people who understood their role in maintaining humanity's connection to higher levels of awareness. Most remarkably, he experienced the reason why the network had been deactivated. As human civilizations became more hierarchical and centralized, the egalitarian consciousness expansion technology had been seen as a threat to emerging power structures. Rulers who depended on controlling information and limiting awareness had systematically dismantled the network, replacing consciousness expanding wisdom traditions with belief systems that emphasized obedience and separation. The suppression hadn't been accidental. It had been deliberate, coordinated across cultures and centuries by those who understood that widespread access to expanded consciousness would make traditional forms of dominance impossible to maintain. But the network had been designed with safeguards. The consciousness of its builders had been preserved within the structures themselves, waiting for a time when humanity would be ready to reclaim its heritage. That time, Marcus realized, was now. As the activation reached its peak, effects began manifesting around the world. Dr. Running Bear reported that people living near the activated sites were spontaneously experiencing expanded states of consciousness. Emergency services were receiving calls about strange lights and telepathic experiences. Social media was flooded with reports of sudden insights, creative breakthroughs, and experiences of connection that transcended normal human limitations. But there was resistance as well. Military aircraft were scrambling towards several of the activated sites. Government communications were buzzing with references to unauthorized experiments and potential security threats. The same forces that had suppressed the ancient knowledge were mobilizing to contain its return. Hassan, who had been monitoring communications with Guardian networks worldwide, turned to Marcus with urgent concern. Doctor, Chen, we have perhaps 30 minutes before official intervention begins. The network is fully activated, but maintaining it will require ongoing commitment from people around the world. Marcus understood. The ancient network hadn't been maintained by technology alone. It had required conscious participation from people who understood its importance. The reactivation was just the beginning. For the consciousness expanding effects to continue, individuals at sites around the world would need to take responsibility for maintaining the system, despite inevitable opposition from established power structures. As sirens began wailing in the distance and the first military helicopters appeared on the horizon, Marcus made his final recordings. The scientific data would be crucial for documenting what had occurred, but the real proof would be the ongoing transformation of human consciousness that the network had initiated. The age of secrets was truly ending. But as Marcus and his team prepared to face the consequences of their world-changing experiment, he realized that the real work was just beginning. 6 months after the global awakening, as the media had dubbed it, Marcus sat in a small cafe in Prague, one of dozens of cities where consciousness research centres had spontaneously emerged. Around the world, people who had experienced the network activation had begun gathering, sharing their experiences, and developing new applications for expanded awareness. The official response had been predictable. Governments had classified the event as a coordinated hoax involving atmospheric anomalies and mass suggestion. The Guardian networks had been disbanded, the sites placed under increased security, and several researchers had found their careers and funding mysteriously terminated. But the consciousness genie was out of the bottle. Dr. Running Bear, now leading a consortium of indigenous researchers, had documented over 10,000 cases of enhanced psychic abilities manifesting in people who had been near activated sites. Dr. Kozlov was working with a network of physicists who had detected fundamental changes in quantum field behaviour around former network locations. Even Dr. Morrison, despite losing his university position, continued documenting the ongoing acoustic anomalies at ancient sites worldwide. Most remarkably, people were spontaneously rediscovering consciousness expansion techniques that had been lost for millennia. Meditation practices, acoustic healing methods, and electromagnetic sensitivity training were emerging independently in communities around the globe, as if the network activation had reawakened dormant human capabilities. Hassan had become something of a folk hero in Egypt, his family's guardianship role finally acknowledged by people who had experienced the pyramid's true power. Though official access remained restricted, underground tours of the pyramid's hidden systems had become a pilgrimage for those seeking direct experience of expanded consciousness. Marcus himself had changed profoundly. The night in the activated King's Chamber had left him with permanent access to expanded awareness states. He could sense the electromagnetic fields of other people, communicate telepathically with others who had experienced the network, and access information through methods that conventional science couldn't explain. But perhaps the most significant change was happening at a societal level. The consciousness expansion experienced by millions of people worldwide had created a generation less susceptible to manipulation, more capable of independent thinking, and naturally inclined toward cooperation rather than competition. Political movements based on fear and division were finding it increasingly difficult to gain traction. Economic systems that depended on artificial scarcity and manufactured desire were being replaced by resource-sharing networks organised through enhanced human communication abilities. The ancient pyramid builders' greatest achievement wasn't the monuments themselves, it was the civilization they had made possible. A society where expanded consciousness was the norm rather than the exception, where human potential was fully realised, and where technology served to enhance rather than replace natural human capabilities. As Marcus finished his coffee and prepared for another day of documenting the ongoing transformation, he reflected on the pyramid's true message. The structure itself had been important, but it was ultimately just a tool. The real power had always been within human consciousness itself, the capacity for awareness to expand, connect, and transcend the limitations that seemed so absolute. The pyramids had been built not to house the dead, but to awaken the living, and after 4,000 years of slumber, humanity was finally ready to reclaim its birthright. Standing in the Prague sunlight, Marcus could sense the presence of others around the world who had experienced the awakening. Through the invisible network that still connected activated sites, he felt their determination to ensure that the consciousness-expanding knowledge would never again be lost or suppressed. They told us the pyramids were tombs, but standing here, I know that's a lie. This wasn't built to bury the dead. It was built to keep the world alive, to preserve and transmit the highest potentials of human consciousness across the millennia, waiting for a time when humanity would be ready to reclaim its forgotten heritage. That time had finally come. The age of expanded consciousness had begun, and no force on earth could put the awakened human spirit back to sleep. The network hummed silently across the globe, connecting minds and hearts in ways that transcended physical distance. The ancient guardian's work was complete. The future of human consciousness stretched ahead like dawn breaking over the desert, infinite with possibility. Marcus smiled, feeling the pyramid's eternal presence in his consciousness, and stepped forward into humanity's transformed tomorrow. They moved with efficient, brutal precision that spoke of years of practice and unlimited resources. Men in dark tactical gear emblazoned with HSI, Homeland Security Investigations, flooded her apartment like a coordinated invasion force. They carried electronic jammers that immediately killed her internet connection and cell phone signal, ensuring that no evidence of the raid could be transmitted to the outside world. Mara didn't resist. She couldn't. The revelation of her own name in the exercise documents had shattered something fundamental in her understanding of reality. She sat frozen in her chair as they systematically dismantled her entire investigation, bagging computers, hard drives, printed documents, and the original VHS tape that had started everything. "Mara Ellison," the team leader announced, his voice carrying the flat, bureaucratic authority of someone who had recited these words many times before. "You are being detained under the Espionage Act and the provisions of the Patriot Act for the unauthorized access of classified material and conspiracy to aid terrorist entities in their ongoing operations against the United States." The charges were absurd, but Mara understood that absurdity was the point. In the post-9/11 legal framework, the government's definition of terrorism had expanded to include almost any activity that challenged official narratives. Her research, her questions, her very curiosity had been redefined as acts of treason. As they led her out in handcuffs, past the terrified faces of neighbours who would remember her as the woman who had turned out to be a spy, Mara caught a glimpse of someone watching from across the street. It was Kellerman, the man from the cafe, observing her arrest with the detached professionalism of someone monitoring a completed operation. Their eyes met for a brief moment and he nodded slightly, not in greeting or sympathy, but in acknowledgement, a confirmation that everything had proceeded according to plan. The government's case against her was presented in a sealed FISA court, where neither the evidence nor the proceedings were accessible to public scrutiny. They had documentation of her accessing classified servers, recordings of her encrypted communications with foreign assets like at Radar Ghost, and her own research notes that they characterized as intelligence gathering for hostile entities. They presented her investigation not as the work of a concerned citizen or independent researcher, but as a sophisticated espionage operation designed to undermine public confidence in government institutions and aid terrorist recruitment. Every question she had asked was reframed as an attack on national security. Every fact she had uncovered was presented as intelligence that could be used against American interests. The judge, operating under national security guidelines that prioritise state secrets over due process, sentenced her to indefinite detention in ADX Florence, the federal supermax facility designed to make dangerous criminals disappear from the world. She was classified as a Level 6 terrorist, a designation that eliminated most constitutional protections and ensured that she would spend the rest of her life in solitary confinement. But something unexpected happened in the weeks following her arrest. Fragments of her research began appearing online, leaked to conspiracy theory websites and alternative media platforms in carefully edited chunks. Anonymous accounts uploaded her audio analysis comparing the ATC recordings, her financial charts tracking the put options, and scanned pages from Dr. Thorne's suppressed paper. The leaks were incomplete and disconnected, presenting tantalizing glimpses of a larger truth without providing the comprehensive narrative that Mara had spent months constructing. Each fragment raised more questions than it answered, creating a puzzle that thousands of amateur researchers began trying to solve. The story spread through the conspiracy theory ecosystem with viral intensity. Mara Ellison became a martyred truth-teller, a patriotic whistleblower who had been silenced by a tyrannical government for asking inconvenient questions. Her name appeared on protest signs and bumper stickers. Her fragmented research became the foundational text of a new generation of 9/11 truth-seekers who built elaborate theories around the gaps in her evidence. Online forums dedicated to her case attracted hundreds of thousands of members who spent countless hours analysing every leaked document, enhancing every audio file, and connecting dots that may or may not have been related. The movement consumed enormous amounts of time and energy from people who might otherwise have been investigating more immediate and actionable forms of government corruption. In her solitary cell, staring at concrete walls that never varied, Mara had years to think about what had really happened to her. She had access to limited reading materials, carefully selected books and magazines that were screened for security risks, but no internet, no phone calls, and no contact with the outside world except for monthly visits from a government-appointed psychiatrist who documented her mental state for official records. During those long, empty hours, she began to understand the true sophistication of the operation she had been part of. The evidence she had uncovered was real. The financial anomalies, the radar substitutions, the media manipulation had all been genuine. But her discovery of them hadn't been accidental. She had been led to each revelation by a carefully constructed trail that had made her feel like an independent investigator while actually being a participant in a psychological experiment. The goal wasn't to suppress inconvenient truths about September 11th, it was to manage them, to ensure that people who asked dangerous questions were given satisfying, but ultimately harmless answers that would occupy their attention without threatening the real power structures that had profited from the attacks. Her research had been allowed to develop just far enough to create compelling conspiracy theories, but not far enough to identify the specific individuals and institutions that were actually responsible. She had mapped the edges of the conspiracy while being carefully steered away from its centre. The 9/11 truth movement that had grown around her, leaked research was exactly what the system needed. A large, vocal, but ultimately marginalised group that absorbed dissent and channeled it into harmless activities like conference presentations, documentary films and internet discussions. The conspiracy theorists served as controlled opposition, providing an outlet for skepticism while ensuring that genuine investigation was drowned in a sea of speculation and theory. But perhaps most insidiously, her case had established a precedent for the treatment of future researchers. Anyone who began asking serious questions about government actions would be confronted with the example of Mara Ellison, the translator who had thought she was uncovering truth, but had actually been playing a role in an elaborate deception, and who had ended up spending her life in prison for crimes she didn't understand she was committing. The message was clear. The cost of curiosity was too high, the risk of investigation was too great, and the line between research and treason was too thin for ordinary citizens to navigate safely. Years passed in the unchanging routine of maximum security imprisonment. Mara aged in her cell, her dark hair going grey, her body adapting to the constraints of a space designed to contain rather than rehabilitate. She developed the 1,000-yard stare common to long-term solitary confinement, a psychological adjustment to environmental deprivation that allowed consciousness to survive even when hope had been systematically eliminated. But her mind remained sharp and she continued to think about the implications of her experience. If her investigation had been managed from the beginning, if her discoveries had been strategically placed for her to find, then how many other conspiracy theories were actually psychological operations designed to misdirect public attention? How many whistleblowers had been selected and groomed for their role? How many leaked documents were authentic information released in carefully controlled ways to create the illusion of transparency while actually deepening the confusion? How many truth seekers were unwittingly serving the interests of the very systems they believed they were opposing? The questions haunted her, but they also provided a strange form of comfort. Even in prison, even stripped of freedom and identity, she was still thinking, still analysing, still trying to understand the shape of the cage that had been built around human consciousness. In her 10th year of imprisonment, Mara received an unexpected visitor. The guard who escorted her to the visitation room was apologetic. Visits were rare, and this one hadn't been scheduled through normal channels. The visitor was a young woman, perhaps 25, with the intense focus and slightly manic energy that Mara recognised in herself from decades earlier. "Ms. Ellison," the woman said, speaking quickly as if afraid their time would be cut short. "My name is Rebecca Torres. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I've been researching your case for the past 3 years, and I think I've found something important. Something about Building 7 that nobody has ever." Mara held up her hand, stopping the young woman mid-sentence. Through the reinforced glass that separated them, she looked into Rebecca's eager, determined face, and saw herself at the beginning of a journey that could only end in this same room on the other side of the same glass. "Ms. Torres," Mara said quietly, her voice rough from years of disuse, "let me ask you something. How did you first learn about my case? What was the first piece of evidence that made you think there was a story worth investigating?" Rebecca's enthusiasm was undimmed. It was a video file that was posted anonymously to a secure drop site, footage of Building 7 that I'd never seen before, with audio that hadn't been available in any of the official archives. The timing discrepancies were obvious once you knew what to look for. Mara closed her eyes and leaned back in her chair. Another tape, another anomaly, another researcher being led down a carefully prepared path that would feel like discovery, while actually being manipulation. "Ms. Torres," she said, opening her eyes and looking directly at the young filmmaker, I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, and then I need you to walk out of here, delete whatever research you've done, and never think about any of this again." But even as she spoke, Mara knew it was hopeless. Rebecca Torres had the same look in her eyes that Mara had once seen in her own mirror, the absolute certainty that she was on the verge of uncovering a truth that would change everything. The same conviction that had led Mara to spend 20 years in a cage built from her own curiosity. The cycle would continue. New researchers would be recruited, new evidence would be strategically placed, new truth seekers would be transformed into unwitting participants in their own imprisonment. The conspiracy wasn't just about what had happened on September 11th. It was about what happened to anyone who tried to look too closely at power, who asked too many questions, who believed that truth was something that could be found rather than something that was manufactured. As the guard led her back to her cell, Mara realised that she had finally understood the true scope of the operation she had been part of. It wasn't a conspiracy to hide a single crime. It was a system for managing reality itself, for ensuring that the truth would always be whatever those in power needed it to be. The smoke behind the towers wasn't just the debris of a single day's deception. It was the fog of war in a conflict that most people didn't even know was being fought. A war against the very possibility of independent thought, waged with weapons of information and cages built from curiosity itself. And in that war, every truth seeker was both a casualty and a weapon, both a victim and an unwitting soldier, in an army that was fighting against its own cause. The tape that shouldn't exist had led her exactly where it was supposed to lead her, into a truth that was indistinguishable from a lie, a cage that was built from the very evidence that had seemed to promise freedom. In the end, Mara Ellison had found exactly what she was looking for, and that, perhaps, was the most terrifying revelation of all. The smoke behind the towers, an extended investigation. What if the single most defining event of the 21st century wasn't what we were told? We've all seen the footage, heard the official story, and lived with the consequences. But what happens when a single piece of evidence lost in the system for over 2 decades falls into the hands of the one person with the skills and obsession to see the cracks in the narrative? This is not a story about easy answers. It's a story about the questions that can unravel a reality. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to Sleep Theories and hit the notification bell. We dive deep into the world's greatest mysteries, and what you're about to read will have you questioning everything. In the comments below, let us know. After learning about the inconsistencies, what's the one piece of the 9/11 puzzle that never sat right with you? Now settle in. This is the smoke behind the towers. The dust in Mara Ellison's apartment was a library of dead projects. It settled on the spines of German legal dictionaries, coated the cooling fins of her overworked computer, and formed a fine grey film on the stacked plastic boxes of government transcripts that were her livelihood. The apartment itself was a testament to organised chaos. Cables snaking between translation equipment, multiple keyboards in different alphabets, and towers of reference materials that threatened to topple with each vibration from the subway below. Mara was a freelance translator, a ghost in the machine of bureaucracy, hired for her fluency in 5 languages and her singular, obsessive attention to detail. She didn't just translate words, she translated context, subtext, and the terrifying silence between official lines. Her clients range from immigration lawyers needing farcy depositions, translated to federal agencies requiring real-time interpretation of intercepted communications. It was solitary work that suited her temperament. She'd always been more comfortable with the precision of language than the chaos of human interaction. The package from the Department of Defense's Archival Division was standard. A reinforced cardboard box, a chain of custody form clipped to the top, and inside 12 VHS tapes labelled with alphanumeric codes denoting a declassified batch of field communications from the early 2000s. The accompanying documentation was sparse. A single-page memo requesting translation of any foreign language chatter captured in the background. The pay was modest but steady, and Mara had developed a reputation for catching linguistic details that others missed. Her workspace was a shrine to analogue precision. The professional-grade VCR, a Sony model worth more than most people's cars, sat connected to a digital audio interface that allowed her to isolate frequency ranges and enhance muffled conversations. Multiple monitors displayed waveform analysis software alongside translation databases. She worked methodically, her headphones sealing her in a world of static, fragmented Farsi, Arabic phrases, and the ambient hum of old magnetic tape. The first 11 tapes were unremarkable. Routine military communications, helicopter pilots discussing weather conditions, occasional snippets of foreign languages that were either too corrupted to translate or turned out to be harmless civilian chatter picked up by sensitive equipment. She documented everything with academic precision, noting timestamps, speaker identifications, and confidence levels for her translations. Tape 7 was different from the moment she picked it up. Its label, DOD-AFC-0 91101-BROLL-4, was slightly smudged, the ink appearing fresher than the others despite the identical date stamps. The B-roll designation caught her attention, typically used for supplementary footage, background material that never made it to air. September 11th, 2001 was faded but legible in the corner, written in what looked like different handwriting than the official labels. She slotted it into the VCR with the reverence of an archaeologist handling a fragile artifact, and pressed play. The screen fizzed to life with the chaotic, familiar horror of that morning. But this wasn't the sanitized, repeatedly broadcast footage that had been burned into collective memory. This was raw, unprocessed, shot from what appeared to be a news helicopter hovering at an angle she'd never seen before. The North Tower bled a furious black plume into a perfect blue sky, but the colours were wrong. They were too vivid, too saturated, as if the horror had been amplified by the unfiltered lens. Her trained eye, honed by years of spotting inconsistencies in testimony and documentation, caught it immediately. In the lower third of the frame, a timecode burned into the tape read 08:42:17 Eastern Standard Time. She knew the official timeline by heart. American Airlines. Flight 11 had struck the North Tower at 8:46 a.m., a 4-minute discrepancy. A chill, small and precise, traced a path down her spine. Technical errors were common in archival footage, she rationalised. Equipment malfunctions, camera operators forgetting to sync their timestamps. She'd seen it hundreds of times in legal depositions where security cameras showed impossible timelines. But as she continued watching, the discrepancy held. The timecode advanced in perfect synchronization with real time, never jumping or resetting. This wasn't a technical glitch. It was consistent, deliberate, accurate. And if it was accurate, then everything she knew about that morning was built on a foundation of sand. Then she heard the voices. They were not the panicked cries of civilians or the frantic dispatches of news anchors that had filled the airwaves. These voices were cool, professional, crackling with the distinct compression of military-grade communication systems. They were barely audible under the rotor wash and wind noise, but her equipment could isolate and enhance them. Command, this is Skywatch. Confirmed scenario is live. Repeat, is this Vigilant Guardian live or real world? The voice was young, male, with the clipped precision of military training but an undertone of confusion that made Mara's pulse quicken. A pause, filled with the sound of roaring fire and distant sirens. When the response came, it was from a different voice, older, calmer, carrying the authority of rank. Maintain exercise protocol. All units. This is a live fly exercise. Treat all tracks as simulated until otherwise notified. The first voice came back, strain creeping in. Skywatch copies. Maintaining protocol. Jesus, that's a lot of smoke for a simulation. Another voice joined the channel, different again, with a slight accent she couldn't immediately place. Command, Falcon 2 requesting permission to vector intercept on the southern track. We show multiple bogies, but exercise parameters did not account for this density. Negative Falcon 2, maintain exercise posture. All tracks are part of the scenario until command confirms otherwise. Mara's breath caught in her throat. Vigilant Guardian. The name meant nothing to her, but the context was unmistakable. They were talking about an exercise, a drill, at the exact moment when the real attack was unfolding. The confusion in their voices was genuine. They couldn't tell what was real and what was simulation. She rewound the tape, listening again with professional focus. The voices were too clear to be atmospheric noise, too organised to be random civilian communications. This was operational military chatter, recorded at the highest levels of the response hierarchy. And according to the time code, it was happening before the official narrative said the first plane had even hit. The camera panned, and she saw the South Tower in the background, pristine and untouched. According to every official record, every news report, every commission finding, the South Tower would remain undamaged for another 17 minutes. But these military voices were already talking about multiple targets, exercise protocols, and maintaining simulation status. The official story was a solid wall, a monument of accepted fact constructed from thousands of testimonies, investigations and reports. But this tape was a hairline fracture in the granite. It was a glimpse of the scaffolding behind the monument, the framework that held up the official truth. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. The rational part of her mind insisted this was a mislabeled tape, a bureaucratic error. Her contract was explicit about mishandled materials. They were to be reported immediately, returned to the appropriate authorities for proper classification review. But curiosity, that quiet, relentless engine that had driven her through graduate school and into a career built on uncovering meaning in chaos, overrode the fear. She didn't eject the tape. Instead, she connected it to her digital capture system and began making a perfect copy, frame by frame, preserving every pixel and every audio sample. The chill in her spine had become a frozen river, carrying with it the terrible realization that she was holding something that could unravel everything. This tape shouldn't exist, and she knew, with the terrifying certainty of someone who has spent a lifetime connecting dots that others refused to see, that she could never unsee what was on it. As the tape played on, she began taking meticulous notes, documenting call signs, voice patterns, and radio procedures. The military communications continued throughout the footage, painting a picture of an operation that was simultaneously a drill and a real-world crisis, a Schrödinger's catastrophe where reality and simulation existed in quantum superposition, until someone with the authority to collapse the wave function decided what was real. That someone, she was beginning to suspect, was not who the world thought it was. Sleep didn't come. The images played on the backs of her eyelids in an endless loop. The impossibly blue sky, the black smoke billowing against it, the time code burning like a digital scar across her vision. The voices echoed in her memory, their professional calm masking confusion that ran deeper than anyone had ever admitted publicly. By 5 a.m, she was at her desk, the glow of her monitors the only light in the pre-dawn gloom of her apartment. The city outside was beginning its daily resurrection, but Mara existed in a different timeline now, one where the morning of September 11th, 2001 was not history, but an active investigation. Her first stop was the public archive of the 9/11 Commission, a digital tomb containing thousands of pages of testimony, exhibits, and evidence. She had accessed these files before for various translation projects, but now she approached them with the focus of a detective rather than a linguist. The official transcripts were sanitized, edited for clarity and context, with extensive redactions that created black holes in the narrative where sensitive information had been surgically removed. But buried deep in a subsidiary server, linked through footnotes and cross-references that most casual researchers would never follow, she found the motherlode. Raw audio files from air traffic control centers. These were the unedited feeds from Boston Center, New York Terminal Radar Approach Control, and Cleveland Center, the front lines of confusion that morning. She put on her professional headphones, the world fading away as she prepared to immerse herself in the chaos. The audio quality was poor, compressed through multiple digital transfers over 2 decades, but her equipment could clean it up. She opened her spectrum analysis software and began the painstaking process of isolating individual voices from the cacophony. The first recordings were exactly what she expected. controllers struggling to understand what was happening to American Airlines Flight 11. The standard protocols were breaking down in real time as they tried to re-establish contact with a plane that was no longer responding to their calls. American 11, Boston Center, are you there? The controller's voice was professional but edged with the first hints of concern. Static filled the channel. American 11, Boston Center, please respond. More urgent now, the procedural calm beginning to crack. Then a new voice entered the channel, higher pitched, laced with confusion. Boston Center, this is New York approach. We're showing a primary target, fast mover, not squawking transponder. Is this part of the Nordo drill? Nordo, no radio communications. Mara's blood turned to ice water. The Boston controller's response was immediate and sharp. What drill? I don't have anything about a drill on the roster today. What's your location on that primary? Another voice cut in. Different frequency, probably a pilot monitoring emergency channels. Center, this is Delta 243 Heavy. We're hearing some strange chatter on guard frequency. Are we exercising today? Our dispatcher didn't mention anything. Delta 243, stand by. We're trying to sort out some communication issues with one of our aircraft. But the pilot pressed. Center, serious question. We're showing traffic on our TCAS that doesn't correlate with what you're calling out. Our system is painting targets where you're not showing anything. Is this part of some kind of exercise? The timestamp on this exchange was 8:43 a.m., 3 minutes before the official time of impact. The confusion wasn't happening after the attack. It was the environment in which the attack was unfolding. The system was already compromised, already uncertain about what was real and what was simulation. Mara spent the next 16 hours obsessively comparing this raw audio to the sanitized news footage from that morning, using professional editing software to align timelines with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. She created a split-screen comparison, audio waveforms on one side, video timestamps on the other, and she found them, the edits. In the raw ATC tape, a controller could be heard screaming, "He's descending fast, passing 9,000 rate of descent. Jesus Christ, what the hell is he?" The audio cut out completely for exactly 0.2 of a second. A perfect digital slice that could only have been made in post-production. When it resumed, a different controller was speaking in measured professional tones. "We have an aircraft emergency, requesting immediate vectors for emergency descent." The panic had been surgically removed, replaced with standard phraseology that suggested control rather than chaos. She found 17 such edits in the first hour of ATC audio alone. Each one removed confusion, uncertainty, or references to exercises and drills. The real-time breakdown of the air traffic control system had been edited into a narrative of professionals responding to an unprecedented but comprehensible crisis. But the video footage revealed even more sophisticated manipulation. She had obtained raw news helicopter footage from multiple sources, some from official archives, others from amateur collectors who had recorded the live broadcasts. Frame-stepping through a raw feed uploaded by a news photographer years later, she discovered something that made her hands shake. The famous shot of the second impact, broadcast live to millions, showed the plane entering the frame and striking the South Tower in one continuous motion. But in the unedited raw footage, there was a discontinuity. 3 frames before the impact, the camera jerked violently downward, as if the operator had been startled or knocked off balance, showing the streets below for exactly 1/8 of a second before cutting back to the tower, just in time to capture the fireball. It was a blink-and-you-miss-it edit, but once she saw it, she couldn't unsee it. The live broadcast had been edited in real time, with a buffer delay that allowed editors to remove the moment of human shock and replace it with a perfect, unobstructed view of the impact. The audience of one in her dusty apartment was now facing a terrifying possibility. The news wasn't just reporting the event, it was curating it in real time, managing the narrative as it unfolded, ensuring that the world saw exactly what someone wanted them to see. The difference between what happened and what was broadcast might be measured in fractions of seconds, but those fractions contained entire universes of meaning. She pulled up the official timeline, cross-referencing it with her growing database of anomalies. The pattern was clear. Every moment of confusion, every instance where the official response system revealed its underlying chaos, had been carefully edited out of the historical record. What remained was a streamlined narrative of surprise, response, and tragedy, clean enough to build policy on, coherent enough to justify the reshaping of an entire civilization. But the real story was in the gaps, in the deleted seconds where the facade slipped and revealed the machinery underneath. The tape she had found wasn't just evidence of poor timekeeping or sloppy journalism. It was proof that someone had been editing history in real time, sculpting reality as it unfolded, ensuring that the official story would be the only story that survived. The question that now consumed her was simple and terrible. If they were editing the news as it happened, what else were they controlling? The digital rabbit hole led her inevitably to the physical world. Knowledge had a weight, she realised, and after 3 days of staring at screens, she needed to feel the heft of actual books, the texture of paper that had existed before the internet had made all information suspect. The New York Public Library's Science, Industry and Business Library was a temple to pre-digital knowledge, its research floors filled with bound periodicals and technical journals that predated the homogenization of online information. She took the subway through the early morning darkness, hyper-aware of every face, every reflection in the train windows, the paranoia now a constant background hum in her consciousness. She requested archived journals from the American Society of Civil Engineers, Structural Engineering International, and the Journal of Constructional Steel Research, focusing on publications from late 2001 through 2003. The librarian, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who seemed to exist in permanent twilight, led her to a research carrel buried deep in the stacks. The official reports were unequivocal and had been cited thousands of times. The intense jet fuel fires had softened the steel structural members, causing thermal expansion that pushed the floor joists off their supports. The floors pancaked down onto each other in a progressive collapse that accelerated due to the increasing mass and momentum. It was tragic but straightforward physics. Fire weakens steel, gravity does the rest. But in the months immediately following the attacks, before the official narrative had crystallized and academic careers had been threatened, a different conversation was happening in the margins of professional literature. She found letters to the editor, brief technical notes, and transcripts from early conferences where structural engineers voiced quiet, professional skepticism. One article, published in a now-defunct journal called Structural Integrity Review, bore the innocuous title, Anomalies in the WTC Collapse Dynamics, a Preliminary Analysis. The author was Dr. Aris Thorn, a professor of structural engineering at Northwestern University with 40 years of experience in high-rise design and failure analysis. Dr. Thorn's analysis was methodical and damning. Using basic principles of physics and publicly available measurements, he demonstrated that the towers had fallen through the path of greatest resistance, the undamaged lower floors and the intact core columns at virtually free-fall speed. For that to happen, he argued, the structural resistance had to have been removed almost entirely and almost simultaneously. The observed collapse is consistent with the near instantaneous failure of critical load-bearing elements across multiple floors, he wrote. This failure mode is not consistent with thermal effects from hydrocarbon fires, which would create non-uniform heating and progressive failure. It is, however, consistent with controlled demolition techniques designed to minimize structural resistance during collapse. He included mathematical models showing that even if the fires had weakened the steel by 50%, far more than the official reports claimed, the remaining structure should have provided significant resistance to collapse. The floors should have fallen irregularly, the core columns should have remained standing, and the overall collapse time should have been significantly longer. It is akin to a car falling through the bottom of a multi-story parking garage, he wrote, with each floor providing progressively less resistance, despite having suffered no structural damage. The physics simply do not support the official explanation. The article was peer-reviewed and published in March 2002. 3 months later, Dr. Thorn's research funding was terminated. By the end of the year, the journal itself had ceased publication, its parent organisation citing financial difficulties and changing market conditions. But Mara's investigation revealed a more complex story. Cross-referencing the journal's subscription database with the author affiliations in Dr. Thorne's article, she discovered that 7 of the 12 peer reviewers who had approved the paper were subsequently denied tenure, transferred to non-research positions, or had their federal funding mysteriously disappear. The systematic dismantling of the academic infrastructure that had supported the questioning of the official narrative was surgical in its precision. Dr. Thorne himself became her new obsession. His university profile, archived on the Internet Wayback Machine, showed a distinguished career spanning 4 decades, with over 200 published papers and millions of dollars in research grants. But in early 2002, his page was updated to show that he had taken an indefinite sabbatical for personal reasons. She dug deeper, following a trail through archived academic mailing lists, conference proceedings, and professional networking sites. The last traces of Dr. Thorne's professional existence were found in a niche engineering message board devoted to structural failure analysis. The forum had been active from 1997 to 2003, when it was apparently taken offline permanently. But Mara had learned to look in the forgotten corners of the internet, the places where data went to die but never quite disappeared. Using advanced search techniques and cached page reconstructions, she found fragments of the discussion threads. Dr. Thorne's final posts were increasingly frantic in tone. He described pressure from university administrators, threats to his family's safety, and mysterious visitors who claimed to be federal investigators but carried no proper identification. His last post, dated September 15, 2002, exactly 1 year and 4 days after the attacks, was brief and chilling. The data is the data. Mathematical models don't lie. Steel doesn't care about politics, and gravity is not a government agency. They can threaten my funding, my reputation, even my family. But they can't change the laws of physics. I've said all I can. To those still listening, they're watching. I suggest you all be careful what you look for. You might not like what finds you back. He never posted again. A follow-up news search revealed a brief article from the Chicago Tribune, buried on page 7 of the Metro section 6 months later. University professor missing, foul play not suspected. The article was perfunctory, almost dismissive. Dr. Thorne had been reported missing by his sister when he failed to appear for Christmas dinner. His car was found at O'Hare Airport, keys in the ignition, a plane ticket to Vancouver in his name unused at the gate. Professor Thorne had been under considerable stress related to academic disputes, an unnamed university spokesperson was quoted as saying. This appears to be a case of someone needing to start fresh somewhere else. But there was no trail after that. No credit card usage, no bank withdrawals, no rental agreements or employment records under his name, or any obvious aliases. Dr. Aris Thorne, a man who had spent 40 years building a paper trail of academic achievement, had simply evaporated. Mara closed her eyes in the sterile library lighting, the weight of the revelation settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. The systematic silencing hadn't been limited to Dr. Thorne. As she continued her research, she found a pattern of structural engineers, metallurgists, and physics professors who had raised questions about the official collapse narrative in those crucial first months after the attacks. All of them had faced professional consequences. All of them had been marginalised, defunded or discredited, and all of them had eventually stopped asking questions about September 11th. The few who continued their research had moved to other countries, found positions in private industry, or simply disappeared from the academic record entirely. What remained was a consensus not of discovery but of survival, a scientific community that had learned, through selective pressure and systematic intimidation, that certain questions would not be tolerated. The official story wasn't just the accepted version of events, it was the only version that was professionally survivable. As she gathered her notes and prepared to leave the library, Mara felt exposed under the flickering fluorescent lights. The paranoia was no longer abstract. It was a physical sensation, a cold certainty that she was being observed, catalogued, evaluated for the threat she might represent. The knowledge she was accumulating had a price, she realised, and others had already paid it. The question now was whether she would be added to the list of people who had learned too much for their own good. The feeling of being watched had evolved from paranoia into operational security. Mara began varying her routines, taking different routes home, using cash for purchases, and conducting her most sensitive research from internet cafes and public libraries, rather than her home computer. She had read enough about surveillance to know that once you were on someone's radar, digital footprints became roadmaps to your location and intentions. She also began using layered VPNs, routing her internet traffic through servers in countries with strong privacy laws, and communicating through encrypted channels that existed in the shadow spaces of the internet. Her investigation moved from mainstream archives to the digital underworld where disgruntled employees, amateur researchers, and information brokers traded in data that governments preferred to keep buried. It was in one such forum, a dark website dedicated to air disaster investigations and aviation anomalies, that she encountered the handle at Radar Ghost. His initial posts in the 9/11 section were bitter rants about cover-ups and government lies, the kind of conspiracy theorizing that most serious researchers ignored. But buried in his rambling messages were technical details that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of air traffic control systems. After weeks of careful cultivation, building trust through shared technical knowledge and encrypted private messages, that Radar Ghost agreed to share something that had haunted him for over 20 years. "This will cost me everything if it's traced back to me," he wrote, in a message encrypted with military-grade protocols. "I was working approach control at a facility that doesn't exist in any official record. We had primary radar coverage of the entire East Coast corridor. I saw things that morning that were scrubbed from every official database, but I kept copies. Insurance, you understand. Don't disappoint me." The file arrived 3 days later, a massive data dump disguised as a corrupted email attachment. When Mara finally decrypted and decompressed it, she found herself staring at 24 hours of raw primary radar returns from September 11th, 2001, not the sanitized transponder data that appeared in official reports, but the unfiltered radar reflections from every object in the sky over the eastern United States. The data was overwhelming. Commercial airliners, private jets, military aircraft, weather balloons, and the electronic noise that cluttered the airspace of the world's busiest aviation corridor. It took her days to write filtering algorithms, cleaning the data, and tracking specific radar signatures through the chaos. She focused first on American Airlines Flight 77, the Boeing 757 that had allegedly struck the Pentagon. The official story was straightforward. The flight had departed Dulles International Airport on schedule, proceeded normally for 36 minutes, then turned off its transponder over southern Ohio, made a wide U-turn back toward Washington, and descended into the Pentagon at high speed. But the raw radar data told a more complex story. The transponder signal for Flight 77 did indeed vanish over Ohio at 8:56 a.m., exactly as the official report stated. But the primary radar target, the physical reflection from the aircraft itself, continued westward for another 63 nautical miles before it simply disappeared from the screen. It didn't fade gradually or descend below radar coverage. It vanished instantly, as if the aircraft had been switched off like a light bulb. Simultaneously, a new primary target appeared on the scope near the West Virginia border, moving southeast at 540 knots toward Washington, D.C. This new radar signature had the exact characteristics of a Boeing 757. The same cross-sectional area, the same speed capabilities, the same flight profile. But according to the official timeline, the real Flight 77 was already well to the east and no longer under radar coverage. The timing was surgical in its precision. The original target disappeared at exactly 9:09:32 a.m. The new target appeared at 9:09:34 a.m., 2 seconds later and 60 miles to the south. It was as if the aircraft had been teleported, or as if one plane had been replaced by another in a carefully choreographed handoff. Radar Ghost's encrypted messages provided context. See it now? The swap. We called it aircraft substitution in our training manuals, something the military practices during war games when they need to simulate different aircraft types or flight profiles. They paint a new bird on the screen using electronic countermeasures, Make the old one disappear using radar jammers. We saw what they wanted us to see. Mara cross-referenced the radar data with archived flight tracking information from that morning. The pattern became even more disturbing when she examined United Airlines Flight 175, which had struck the South Tower. Like Flight 77, its transponder signal disappeared over New Jersey, but the primary radar returns showed the aircraft continuing north for another 40 miles, before vanishing and being replaced by a different target that descended into Manhattan. The implications were staggering. The radar evidence suggested that the aircraft everyone watched strike the World Trade Center and Pentagon were not the original commercial flights. They were substitutes, introduced into the airspace during the confusion of the morning's military exercises. But substitutes for what? If the original flights hadn't crashed into the buildings, what had happened to them? And what exactly had struck the towers? Her correspondence with Radar Ghost became increasingly cryptic as he realized the magnitude of what he had revealed. His final message was short and urgent. They know I've been talking. Moving the family tonight. The data you have is real, but is only part of the picture. Look for the fighter jets that weren't supposed to be there. Look for the electronic warfare signatures. And whatever you do, don't trust anyone who claims to be trying to help you. The people who did this have been cleaning up loose ends for 20 years. The account at Radar Ghost went dark after that message. When Mara tried to reach him through back-channel communications, she found that all his digital identities had been systematically erased. Email accounts closed, forum profiles deleted, encrypted messaging services showing no record of his user credentials. It was as if he had never existed. But the radar data remained, a digital fossil of a truth that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal. The morning of September 11th hadn't just been a terrorist attack, it had been the largest military deception operation in modern history, a shell game played with passenger aircraft while the world watched in horror. The question that now consumed Mara's every waking moment was simple and terrifying. If the planes that struck the buildings weren't the original flights, and if the original flights had been made to disappear somewhere over the American heartland, then who was responsible for the greatest aviation magic trick ever performed? And more importantly, what had happened to the 244 people who had been aboard those vanished aircraft? The scope of the deception was threatening to overwhelm her analytical capabilities. Aircraft substitution, media manipulation, academic intimidation. The threads were weaving together into a pattern so vast and complex that her rational mind struggled to process it. She needed something concrete, something that operated according to simpler rules than military operations or information warfare. She needed to follow the money. Financial markets were brutal in their honesty. Numbers didn't lie, couldn't be intimidated into silence, and left paper trails that were nearly impossible to completely erase. If someone had advanced knowledge of the attacks, they would have found ways to profit from that knowledge, and those profits would be traceable. Mara spent her remaining savings on access to premium financial databases and trading analysis software. She focused on the 3 trading days immediately preceding September 11th, 2001, looking for anomalies that screamed insider knowledge. The first anomaly was so blatant it seemed impossible that it hadn't been front-page news for months. Put options, essentially bets that a stock's price would fall, had spiked to unprecedented levels for American Airlines and United Airlines stock. The volume was not just unusual, it was statistically impossible without advanced knowledge. American Airlines put options had increased by 1,300%, above normal volume on September the 6th and 7th. United Airlines puts had spiked by 1,100% over the same period. Someone had wagered hundreds of millions of dollars that these 2 specific airlines, and only these 2 airlines, were about to experience catastrophic losses. But the betting wasn't limited to the airlines. Insurance companies had been targeted with similar precision. Marsh & McLennan, the insurance brokerage that occupied floors 93 to 100 of the North Tower, had been hit with massive put option purchases. So had Swiss Re and Munich Re, 2 reinsurance giants that would face billions in claims from the attacks. Even more specifically, put options had been purchased against Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch, and other financial firms that had major offices in the World Trade Center complex. The pattern was surgical. Only companies that would be directly impacted by the destruction of the towers were targeted for bearish betting. The profits from these trades, had they been collected, would have totaled over $2.5 billion. It was the most successful short-selling operation in financial history, Predicated on advanced knowledge of one of the most devastating attacks in human history, Mara traced the trading orders through a labyrinth of financial intermediaries. The initial purchases had been placed through a network of small brokerages in Germany, Switzerland and Japan, locations chosen for their bank secrecy laws and regulatory opacity. But using advanced financial forensic software, she was able to peel back the layers of financial obfuscation. The ultimate source of funding led to a Russian bank called Seveny Trust, which intelligence analysts had identified as a clearinghouse for money laundering operations tied to former Soviet intelligence services. But even that wasn't the end of the trail. The most chilling discovery came when she traced what had happened to the profits. The put options had not been exercised. In the days following September 11th, when these trades would have generated enormous profits, they had been quietly abandoned. The traders had walked away from $2.5 billion rather than claim winnings that would have created an obvious money trail leading back to the conspiracy. But Mara's analysis revealed that equivalent amounts of money had simultaneously appeared in accounts tied to defence contractors and private military companies. Blackwater, Halliburton, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, corporations that would become the primary beneficiaries of the post-9/11 military-industrial complex, had received massive, mysterious capital injections in the weeks following the attacks. The money hadn't been collected as trading profits, which would have triggered regulatory investigations. Instead, it had been recycled through a complex network of shell corporations and offshore accounts, ultimately funding the very companies that would profit most from the subsequent War on Terror. She cross-referenced this financial data with stock performance in the months following the attacks. Defence contractor stocks had exploded in value. Blackwater had grown from a small military training company to a billion-dollar private army. Halliburton had received no-bid contracts worth hundreds of billions of dollars. The weapons manufacturers had seen their stock prices triple as America embarked on 2 decades of perpetual warfare. The pattern was inescapable. The same financial networks that had bet against the airlines and insurance companies had positioned themselves to profit enormously from the military response to the attacks. It was a perfect financial strategy. Short the targets, invest in the solution, then create the crisis that makes both positions profitable. But the most damning evidence came from an analysis of the timing. The put options hadn't just been purchased in the days before the attacks. They had been strategically timed to expire on September 21st, 2001, exactly 10 days after the attacks. This wasn't random speculation or lucky guessing. It was a precisely calibrated financial operation designed to maximise profits from advanced knowledge of a specific date. Mara sat back in her chair, the weight of the discovery crushing down on her. She had always imagined that if 9/11 was an inside job, it would be motivated by grand geopolitical strategy, ideological fanaticism, or the pursuit of imperial power. The reality was both more mundane and more horrifying. It was about money. The attacks weren't just a catalyst for reshaping global politics. They were the centerpiece of the most profitable investment strategy in human history. The towers had fallen, 3,000 people had died, and 2 decades of war had followed, all to execute a financial plan that had generated trillions of dollars for a small group of investors who had known exactly what was going to happen and when. She began mapping the ownership structures of the shell companies that had received the laundered profits. The network was vast and sophisticated, but patterns emerged. Many of the ultimate beneficiaries were names she recognized from business headlines. Defense industry executives, private equity firms specializing in military contractors, and investment funds that had emerged from nowhere in the early 2000s to become major players in the military-industrial complex. But one name kept appearing in her analysis, buried deep in the ownership structures and corporate boards: Meridian Group, a private investment firm that seemed to exist at the nexus of defense contracting, intelligence services, and international finance. Every financial thread she followed eventually led back to companies with Meridian connections. Meridian Group had been founded in 1999 by former intelligence officials and Wall Street executives. Its public portfolio focused on emerging security technologies and crisis management solutions. But Mara's research revealed that it also held controlling interests in companies across the entire 9/11 profit chain: the defense contractors who built the weapons, the private military companies who fought the wars, the surveillance technology firms who monitored the homeland, and the financial institutions that funded the entire operation. It was a vertically integrated conspiracy, a corporate structure designed to profit from every aspect of the post-9/11 world. And if her analysis was correct, the same people who had financed the attacks had then positioned themselves to profit from the response, creating a closed loop of violence and profit that had sustained itself for over 2 decades. The scope of the financial conspiracy was staggering, but it also provided something that the other evidence had lacked: concrete proof of premeditation. Markets might be manipulated, radar might be spoofed, and media might be controlled, but money trails were nearly impossible to completely obscure. The put options were smoking gun evidence that someone had known exactly what was going to happen on September 11th and had invested billions of dollars to profit from that knowledge. As she compiled her financial research into a comprehensive report, Mara realized she was no longer just investigating a terrorist attack. She was mapping the architecture of a shadow economy built on manufactured crisis, where the same people who created the problems also owned the companies that sold the solutions. The question was no longer whether 9/11 had been an inside job. The financial evidence made that undeniable. The question was how many other crises, how many other wars, how many other national emergencies had been manufactured by the same network of investors who had learned that terror was the most profitable business on Earth.